The 9-year-old girl watched her father's hands shake as he gripped the wrench. The same hands that once designed skyscrapers now trembling over a broken transmission. Mason Drake had sworn he'd never use his engineering mind again, not after what his brilliance had cost him. But when a stranded billionaire's car rolled into his hidden garage on the worst night of the year, his daughter Ruby saw something he couldn't, a chance to rebuild what grief had demolished. Sometimes the hardest structures to repair aren't made of steel. They're made of shattered hearts and second chances. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain came down like it had a personal vendetta against the town of Millbrook. Not the romantic drizzle from movies, but the kind that turned roads into rivers and made you question whether your roof would hold. Mason Drake stood in his garage workshop, listening to water drum against the metal panels overhead, wondering if the leak in the northeast corner had gotten worse. Probably. Everything got worse eventually. "Dad, the pan's almost full." He turned to see Ruby dragging the dented bucket across the concrete floor, sloshing rainwater with each step. 9 years old, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone twice her age. She'd learned early that things broke if you weren't careful. People, especially. "I'll grab another one." Mason wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days, maybe a decade ago. The garage smelled like motor oil, metal shavings, and the particular mustiness that came from a building that had been standing since the 70s. He'd bought the property for almost nothing 3 years ago, mostly because it was far enough outside town that people didn't ask questions. Ruby positioned the empty bucket under the leak with the precision of a miniature engineer. She stepped back, studied it from 2 angles, then nudged it half an inch to the left. Mason felt something twist in his chest. She had his exactness, his need to get things right. He didn't know whether to be proud or terrified. "Better?" she asked. "Perfect." She smiled, and for a second she looked exactly like her mother. Same slope to her nose, same way her eyes crinkled at the corners. Then the moment passed, and she was just Ruby again, wearing an oversized sweatshirt with a faded logo from some tech company Mason used to work with. Ancient history now. "Are you going to finish the Bronson job tonight?" Ruby had climbed onto the stool near his main workbench, swinging her legs. She'd gotten taller recently. Next year she'd be able to reach the floor. "Probably not. Need a part that won't come in until Tuesday." "You should call and tell them." "I will." "You always say that, and then you forget." Mason started to argue, then stopped because she was right. He did forget. The administrative side of running even a small operation like this, the calls, the emails, the basic human interaction, felt like speaking a language he'd forgotten how to use. The mechanical work, though, that still made sense. Engines didn't lie. Transmissions didn't make small talk. You fixed what was broken or you didn't, and the metal didn't care about your tragic backstory. "I'll set a reminder," he said. Ruby pulled out her phone, a basic model he'd gotten her last Christmas against his better judgment, and typed something. "Done. It'll go off at 9 tomorrow morning." "When did you become my secretary?" "Somebody has to be." The rain intensified, hammering so hard against the roof that conversation became difficult. Mason moved to the garage's side door and looked out across the lot. His truck sat in its usual spot, getting thoroughly soaked. Beyond that, nothing but darkness and the blur of water cascading off the edge of the building. The road was invisible from here, which was one of the reasons he'd chosen this place. Nobody stumbled onto Mason Drake's garage by accident. Except tonight, apparently, someone did. Headlights cut through the rain, wavering and uncertain. Mason frowned. The road past his property didn't lead anywhere except to the old Millbrook quarry, and nobody went there anymore. The car, something small and European from the look of it, was moving too slowly, its engine making a sound that even at this distance made Mason wince. Timing belt, maybe. Or worse. The car stuttered, lurched, and died about 50 yards from his garage entrance. "Someone broke down," Ruby said. She'd appeared beside him at the door, standing on tiptoe to see out. "Looks like it." "Are you going to help them?" Mason's first instinct was no. His second instinct was also no. He didn't need complications, didn't need strangers showing up with questions about why a guy with his credentials was running a garage in the middle of nowhere. But Ruby was watching him with those dark, serious eyes, and he could already see the disappointment forming if he said what he was thinking. "Stay inside," he told her. He grabbed a rain jacket from the hook by the door, barely waterproof anymore, held together mostly by habit, and stepped into the deluge. The cold hit him immediately, soaking through his jeans in seconds. He jogged toward the dead car, already regretting this decision. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. That was his first impression. A woman, late 20s or early 30s, wearing clothes that cost more than his truck. Even drenched and windblown, she had that put-together look of someone who'd never had to check her bank balance before buying groceries. Dark hair plastered to her face, heels completely impractical for the current weather situation. "Do you need help?" Mason had to shout over the rain. She looked at him with an expression somewhere between relief and wariness. "My car died. I'm not sure what happened." "Pop the hood." "What?" "The hood. Pop it." She stared at him blankly, and Mason realized she probably had no idea where the hood release was. He leaned past her. She stiffened slightly and found the lever himself. The hood came up with a mechanical sigh, and Mason pulled out his phone, using the flashlight to peer into the engine compartment. Timing belt. He'd been right. Snapped clean through, probably because whoever maintained this car had ignored the service schedule for about 20,000 miles too long. The engine itself looked pristine otherwise. This was a well-made machine, just poorly cared for. "You're not driving this anywhere tonight," Mason said, straightening up. Water ran down the back of his neck. "Timing belt's gone. Can you fix it?" "Not in the rain, and not without parts I don't have." The woman's face fell. She pulled out her phone, thumbed at the screen, then made a noise of frustration. "No signal." "Yeah, it's spotty out here." Mason glanced back toward his garage. Ruby was visible in the doorway, backlit and curious. He should send this woman away, tell her to walk to the main road and flag down help. It was only a couple miles. In a thunderstorm. In heels. "Look, you can use my phone to call someone. Garage is right there." She hesitated, clearly trying to decide if following a strange man into an isolated garage was a worse option than staying here. Mason understood. He probably looked like exactly the kind of person your parents warned you about. Unshaven, wearing clothes with oil stains that would never wash out, living in the middle of nowhere. "I'm Vivien," she said finally. "Mason." He didn't offer his hand. They were both too wet for that to mean anything. They walked to the garage, Vivien picking her way carefully across the gravel lot. Her heels kept sinking. Mason found himself wondering what had brought someone like her out to this part of Millbrook. Lost, probably. People with money didn't end up here on purpose. Ruby stepped aside as they entered, her eyes going wide. Mason knew what she was seeing. A woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, even soaked and bedraggled. Everything about Vivien suggested a different world than the one they inhabited. "Hi," Ruby said. "Hello." Vivien managed a smile. "That's a lot of rain." "Dad says it's because of the warm front meeting the cold system from the north. Atmospheric instability." "Ruby," Mason said quietly. "What?" "That's what you said." Vivien's smile turned more genuine. "You know about weather patterns?" "Dad explained stuff." Ruby shrugged like this was obvious. "Used to be an engineer." Mason felt the familiar tightness in his chest. He moved to his desk, digging through the clutter for his phone. "You can call from here. Reception's better inside." Vivien took the phone but didn't dial immediately. Her gaze had shifted to the garage itself. The organized chaos of tools, the half-finished projects, the blueprints tacked to one wall that Mason kept meaning to take down. Her expression changed, sharpened. "Structural engineering?" she asked, nodding toward the blueprints. "Used to be. These are impressive." She moved closer to the wall, studying the drawings. They were from his old life back when he'd worked for Meridian Design Group in the city. Commercial buildings, mostly. A library that had won some award he couldn't remember. "Did you design these?" "Long time ago." "Why did you stop?" The question was casual, just making conversation, but it hit like a fist to the sternum. Mason busied himself with straightening tools that didn't need straightening. "Life happens. You going to make that call?" Vivien looked at him for a long moment, then down at the phone. She dialed, waited, spoke briefly to someone named Harrison. Her side of the conversation was clipped, professional. Yes, the car had broken down. No, she wasn't hurt. She'd need a ride. The address, she looked at Mason questioningly. 47 Old Quarry Road, he supplied. She repeated it, listened, then frowned. How long? Another pause. Fine. Yes. I'll wait. She ended the call and handed the phone back. My driver says it'll be about 90 minutes. The main highway's flooded and he has to take the long way around. You have a driver? Ruby asked. Ruby, Mason said again. What? I'm just asking. Vivien's expression flickered with something Mason couldn't quite read. Embarrassment, maybe. Or defensiveness. Yes, I have a driver. I work a lot and it's easier than dealing with parking. What do you do? Ruby had settled onto her stool, clearly prepared to conduct a full interview. I'm a teacher, sort of. It's temporary. You don't seem like a teacher. Ruby. Sorry. But she didn't look sorry. She looked fascinated. Vivien surprised them both by laughing. You're right, I'm not very good at it. The students mostly just tolerate me. Why do you do it if you're not good at it? That's a complicated question. I'm 9. I can handle complicated. This time Vivien really looked at Ruby, seemed to actually see her. Mason watched the woman's face shift through several micro-expressions. Surprise, interest, something that might have been recognition. I suppose I wanted to try something different, something that mattered. Teaching matters, Ruby said firmly. Ms. Peterson says teachers shape the future. Ms. Peterson sounds smart. She is. She's my teacher. Well, was. I'm on break now. The conversation continued, Ruby asking questions with the relentless curiosity she'd inherited from Mason's mother, Vivien answering with increasing ease. Mason found himself relegated to the background, which was fine, better than fine. He could work while they talked. He moved to the Bronson job, a transmission rebuild that was proving more complicated than the owner had admitted. The gears were worn down in ways that suggested the driver had been grinding them for months. Mason lost himself in the familiar rhythm of disassembly, cataloging damage, planning repairs. This was where his mind went quiet, where he didn't have to think about anything except the mechanical problem in front of him. That's fascinating, Vivien said. Mason looked up. Both she and Ruby had migrated closer, watching him work. What is? The way you approach it. Very methodical. Vivien pointed to the array of parts he'd laid out in precise order. You're mapping the whole system before you fix anything. Only way to do it right. Most mechanics I know just dive in. Most mechanics miss the underlying problems that way. Mason picked up a gear, examined the wear pattern. This transmission didn't fail because of bad luck. It failed because someone ignored warning signs for months, maybe years. You fix the immediate break without understanding the cascade that led to it. You're just putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Vivien was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had changed, softer. That's a good metaphor. It's just maintenance. No, it's more than that. It's about seeing systems, understanding how failure propagates. She paused. You really were an engineer. I work on cars now. Why? There it was again. The question he couldn't answer, not honestly, not without unraveling things he'd spent 3 years carefully sealing away. Mason set down the gear and reached for his coffee mug, discovered it was empty, put it back down. Ruby, bless her, intervened. Can I show you the cat? Vivien blinked. The cat? She's not really our cat. She just lives here. Dad says she's feral, but I think she's just independent. I'd love to see the cat. They disappeared toward the back of the garage where a gray tabby had taken up residence in a box of shop rags. Mason exhaled slowly, tension he hadn't realized he was carrying releasing from his shoulders. He needed to be more careful. Vivien was clearly educated, clearly observant, the kind of person who would wonder about inconsistencies, who might ask around town about the former engineer running a garage in the woods. Not that there was much to find. He'd been careful about that too. He worked for another 20 minutes, the transmission slowly revealing its secrets. The damage was extensive but repairable. Everything was repairable if you had enough patience and the right tools. He was contemplating whether he had the right synchronizer ring in stock when he heard Vivien's laugh. It was unexpected, bright and unself-conscious, the sound of someone genuinely delighted. Mason looked up to see Ruby demonstrating how the cat would high-five for treats. Vivien crouched down in her expensive, probably ruined clothes, watching with complete attention. She's brilliant, Vivien said, glancing up at Mason. The cat or your daughter? I'm not sure which. Ruby trains animals. And people, apparently. I heard that, Ruby called. You were supposed to. Vivien stood, brushing cat hair from her skirt. It was a losing battle. How long have you two been out here? 3 years. Just the two of you? The question was gentle, but Mason felt his defenses snap into place anyway. Just us. That must be... Vivien stopped herself. I'm sorry, that's none of my business. It's fine. It wasn't, but Mason had learned that sometimes lying was easier than explaining. Ruby had gone quiet, the way she always did when conversations drifted toward her mother. Mason caught her eye and she gave him a small nod. I'm okay. They had a whole vocabulary of looks and gestures built up over 3 years of it being just them against the world. Vivien's phone buzzed. She checked it, frowned. Harrison says he's still 40 minutes out. The flooding's worse than he thought. You can wait inside if you want. There's a break room with a space heater that mostly works. Actually, would you mind if I stayed out here? I'm curious about what you're doing. Mason minded very much. Having an audience made him self-conscious, made him think too hard about his process, instead of just letting his hands remember what his brain wanted to forget. But Ruby was looking at him with that expression, the one that meant, please, Dad, don't be weird about this, and he found himself nodding. Sure, just don't expect me to explain everything. I'm not a teacher. Lucky for you, I am. Sort of. Vivien pulled over a work stool and sat down, careful to stay out of his way. I'll just observe. She did observe. Closely. Mason felt her attention like a physical weight as he worked through the transmission rebuild, checking each component, measuring tolerances, making notes in his mental catalog of what needed replacing. Normally, he'd listen to music while he worked, old blues usually, something with enough grit to match his mood. But the silence felt too loaded now. He was hyper-aware of his movements, wondering what she was seeing. You don't use a manual, Vivien said after a while. Don't need one. You've memorized the specifications? For most common models, yeah. That's remarkable. Mason grunted, focusing on a particularly stubborn bolt. The thread was stripped, probably by whoever had attempted this repair before giving up and bringing it to him. He'd have to drill it out, retap the hole. Annoying, but not impossible. My father used to say that real expertise is invisible, Vivien continued. That amateurs need instructions, but masters work from understanding. Your father sounds smart. He runs a company, several companies actually. He's very good at delegating the understanding to other people. There was an edge to her voice, something sharp and complicated. Mason glanced up and caught an expression on her face that surprised him. Frustration maybe, or resentment. It was gone quickly, smoothed over with professional neutrality, but he'd seen it. Not a fan of the family business? He asked. It's complicated. Complicated's a word people use when they don't want to explain. Vivien's laugh was different this time, shorter, more rueful. Fair enough. Let's just say I'm taking a break from expectations. Hence the teaching. Hence the teaching. She paused. What about you? Taking a break from expectations? Something like that. They fell into silence again, but it felt different now. Less loaded. Mason worked and Vivien watched, and somewhere in the background Ruby was reading on her tablet, occasionally looking up to observe the adults like they were particularly interesting specimens. The transmission was fighting him. The synchro ring was scored worse than he'd initially thought, which meant he'd need to fabricate a replacement instead of using stock parts. That would add days to the timeline. The Bronsons wouldn't be happy, but they'd be even less happy if he half-assed the repair and the transmission failed again in 6 months. Problem? Vivien asked, just calculating timelines. Mason wiped his hands, leaving dark smears on the rag. This is going to take longer than I quoted. Are you going to tell them? Have to. It's their car. But they won't like it. Probably not. Mason shrugged. That's the job sometimes. People want cheap and fast, but cheap and fast usually means broken again in a year. I'd rather lose a customer than do sloppy work. Vivien tilted her head, studying him. That's principled. That's just not being a hack. Most people would take the easy route. Most people aren't responsible for whether the repair holds. Mason gestured at the exposed transmission. This fails at highway speed. Someone could get hurt. I'm not having that on my conscience. Something shifted in Vivien's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. You take it personally. It's my name on the work. No, I mean, you really take it personally. Like each repair is a promise. Mason didn't know what to say to that. It was too close to accurate, too close to the part of himself he'd tried to bury along with his engineering career. The part that couldn't tolerate failure, couldn't accept good enough, couldn't sleep at night if he thought he'd cut a corner somewhere. The part that had broken him. Ruby saved him again, appearing with mugs of hot chocolate she'd made in the break room microwave. "It's the cheap kind," she announced, "but I put extra marshmallows in." Vivien accepted hers with a smile that looked genuine. "Thank you, this is perfect." They drank in companionable silence, the rain continuing its assault on the roof. Mason found himself relaxing incrementally, the rigid control he usually maintained loosening just slightly. There was something about Vivien, the way she asked questions without pushing, observed without judging, existed in his space without demanding anything from it, that made her less threatening than most strangers. Still dangerous, though. Anyone who looked too closely was dangerous. "Dad used to build skyscrapers," Ruby said suddenly. Mason's mug stopped halfway to his mouth. "Ruby, what? You did. You showed me pictures. That was a long time ago." But Vivien was interested now, leaning forward slightly. "Skyscrapers?" "Commercial buildings," Mason corrected. "And I was part of a team. I didn't build anything alone." "What changed?" "Everything," Mason thought. "Everything changed, and I couldn't figure out how to keep going, so I stopped." Out loud, he said, "Priorities shifted." It was Ruby who filled in the gaps, because of course it was. Mom died and Dad couldn't do the job anymore, so we moved here. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to quiet, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. Mason felt his chest constrict, that familiar vice grip of grief and guilt and rage at the unfairness of it all. Vivien's face had gone soft. "I'm so sorry." It was 3 years ago. Ruby's voice was matter-of-fact, the way kids could be when they'd processed something adults were still drowning in. "Dad says we don't talk about it because it makes people uncomfortable, but I think that's dumb because it happened, and pretending it didn't doesn't help anything." "Ruby," Mason said, but there was no heat in it, just exhaustion. "She's right," Vivien said quietly. "Pretending doesn't help." Mason looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes that made him think she knew about loss, about the kind of grief that reshaped you into someone you didn't recognize. They held eye contact for a moment, something unspoken passing between them, and then Mason looked away because it was too much. "Your driver should be here soon," he said. Vivien checked her phone. 15 minutes, apparently. "I'll tow your car into the bay once the rain lets up. Keep it dry until I can get the parts ordered." "How much will it cost?" Mason did quick mental math. "Parts and labor, probably around 800. Could be more if there's collateral damage I haven't found yet." "That's reasonable." "I haven't even diagnosed it fully yet." "I trust your estimate." Vivien finished her hot chocolate, set the mug down carefully. "You strike me as someone who doesn't inflate numbers. I just charge what's fair. Like I said, reasonable." Headlights swept across the garage entrance. A black town car pulled up, pristine despite the weather, and a man in a dark suit emerged with an umbrella. Harrison, presumably. He looked exactly like what Mason would have imagined. Professional, discreet, probably paid more than Mason cleared in a month. Vivien stood, brushing at her clothes in a futile attempt to look presentable. "Thank you for letting me wait here. And for the hot chocolate." "No problem." She turned to Ruby. "It was lovely meeting you. You're a remarkable kid." Ruby beamed. "You should come back when Dad fixes your car." "Ruby," Mason said for what felt like the 100th time that night. But Vivien was smiling. "I'd like that, actually. I'm curious to see how the transmission rebuild turns out. Most people just want their car back." "I'm not most people." No, Mason thought. She definitely wasn't. He walked her to the door, stood under the slight overhang as she dashed through the rain to the waiting car. Harrison held the umbrella, perfectly angled, and handed her into the back seat with practiced efficiency. The town car pulled away, taillights disappearing into the storm, and then it was just Mason and Ruby again. "She was nice," Ruby said. "Yeah. Pretty, too." "Ruby, what?" "I'm just saying." Ruby started gathering the mugs, her expression too innocent. "You should ask her out when she comes back." "I'm not asking anyone out." Why not? Because I'm not. That's not a reason. Mason locked the garage door, checked the leak bucket, started turning off lights. It's late. You should be in bed. It's only 9:30. Exactly. Late. Ruby rolled her eyes, but headed toward the stairs that led to their apartment above the garage. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, a living room that doubled as dining room and office, and anything else they needed it to be. But it was theirs, and it was private, and it didn't come with questions from neighbors or judgments from people who thought they knew better. Mason did his final walkthrough, a ritual he'd developed over the years. Check the tools, check the locks, check the windows. Make sure everything was secure. Make sure nothing could get in that he didn't want in. Control the environment, control the variables, control the risk. Except tonight a variable had slipped through anyway. A stranded billionaire with observant eyes and uncomfortable questions and a way of looking at him that suggested she saw more than he wanted to show. He stood in the dark garage, listening to Ruby moving around upstairs, and tried to convince himself that this didn't change anything. Vivien would pick up her car in a few days, pay the bill, and disappear back into whatever world she'd come from. Their lives would return to the careful routine he'd built, safe, predictable, contained. But something about the way she'd watched him work, the way she'd talked to Ruby like an equal instead of a child, the way she'd said, "I'm not most people," like it was both a warning and a promise. It stuck with him. Mason climbed the stairs, checked on Ruby, already asleep, book still open on her chest, and stood in his own doorway, looking at the room he'd been sleeping in for 3 years. Same bed, same walls, same view of the woods behind the garage. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He didn't sleep well that night. The rain hammered on, and somewhere in the darkness, he kept thinking about the woman who'd looked at his old blueprints and asked why he'd stopped. As if stopping was a choice. As if he'd had any choice at all after the hospital, after the funeral, after Ruby had looked at him with those 2 old eyes and said, "It's just us now, isn't it, Dad?" Just them. That's how it had to stay. Even if part of him, the part he tried very hard not to listen to, wondered what it might be like to let someone else in. The timing belt arrived on Tuesday, exactly when the supplier said it would. Mason signed for the package, carried it into the garage, and set it on his workbench with more force than necessary. He'd been hoping it would be delayed. A week, maybe 2. Long enough that Vivien would give up and have the car towed to some dealership in the city where they'd charge her triple, and she'd never think about the garage in Millbrook again. No such luck. He called her number. She'd left it written on a business card that was embossed, because of course it was, and got voicemail. Professional, crisp, the voice of someone who fielded dozens of calls a day. He left a message about the part arriving and hung up before he could overthink it. Ruby was at the kitchen table doing summer workbooks when he came upstairs for lunch. She looked up, pencil poised over a math problem. "Did you call her?" "How did you know I was calling anyone?" "You use your business voice. It's different from your regular voice." Mason opened the fridge, stared at its contents without really seeing them. "I don't have a business voice." "You totally do. It's like half an octave lower, and you don't use contractions." He grabbed sandwich materials, assembled lunch on autopilot. Turkey, cheese, mustard. Same thing he'd been eating for 3 years. "You're imagining things." "I'm not. You did it with Mr. Bronson last week, too." Ruby had abandoned her math, more interested in this conversation. "Is she coming to pick up her car?" "Probably." "When?" "I don't know. She hasn't called back yet." "Maybe she's busy teaching." "Maybe." Ruby watched him eat for a moment, then went back to her workbook. But Mason could feel her thinking, that particular quality of attention that meant she was working on something in her head. His daughter was too smart for her own good, too observant. She noticed things he wished she wouldn't. The phone rang 20 minutes later. Mason was elbow deep in the Vivien's engine bay when he heard it echoing from upstairs. He ignored it. If it was important, they'd leave a message. But then Ruby appeared at the top of the stairs, holding his phone. "It's her," she called down. Mason wiped his hands and climbed up, taking the phone. Ruby made no move to leave, just stood there with unconcealed interest. "This is Mason." "Hi, it's Vivien Langford. You called about the part?" "Yeah, it came in. I can have the car ready by Thursday if that works." "Thursday's perfect, actually. I have the afternoon free." A pause. "How much do I owe you?" Mason did the math. Parts, labor, the tow into the bay. $785. You said it might be more. Turned out to be less. No collateral damage. Thank you. I'll bring a check when I pick it up. Cash is fine too. Another pause, longer this time. In the background, Mason could hear voices, young voices, overlapping in that particular chaos of a classroom. I'm actually teaching right now. Can I call you back this evening to confirm the time? Sure. Great, talk then. She hung up. Mason stood there holding the phone, aware of Ruby watching him. What? He said. Nothing. But she was smiling. Go finish your math. Already done. Then find something else to do. Ruby retreated, still smiling, and Mason went back downstairs feeling like he'd lost an argument he hadn't realized he was having. The repair went smoothly. The new timing belt slipped into place like it had been waiting for him, all the components aligning with that satisfying precision that made mechanical work worth doing. Mason took his time, double-checking every connection, making sure the tension was exactly right. This was someone's transportation, someone's safety. It mattered. Vivien called that evening as promised. They arranged for Thursday at 2. She sounded distracted, tired. Mason wondered what teaching was like for someone who clearly didn't need the money, what it felt like to choose something difficult when you could choose easy instead. Thursday arrived faster than he wanted. Mason spent the morning trying not to think about it, which meant he thought about it constantly. He cleaned the garage more thoroughly than necessary, organized tools that were already organized, checked Vivien's car 3 times to make sure everything was perfect. You're nervous, Ruby observed. She was sitting on her stool, supposedly reading but clearly monitoring him. I'm not nervous. You cleaned the bathroom. You never cleaned the bathroom. It needed it. Dad. Mason stopped pretending to inventory spark plugs and looked at his daughter. What do you want me to say? That you like her. I don't know her. But you want to. He didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, he had several answers and none of them were appropriate for a conversation with a 9-year-old. So he just went back to the spark plugs and tried to ignore Ruby's knowing expression. Vivien arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. Not the town car this time. She drove herself, in a different vehicle, something practical and American. She parked next to Mason's truck and got out wearing jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget, but at least looked comfortable. Hi, she said. Hey, car's ready? That was fast. Straightforward repair once I had the parts. They stood there for a moment in the kind of awkward silence that made Mason want to retreat into the garage and hide behind an engine block. But Vivien was looking at him with that same observant expression from before, like she was trying to figure something out. Can I see it? She asked. The repair, I mean. I'm curious how it works. Mason hesitated. Most customers just wanted their keys back. But Vivien wasn't most customers, and he'd already established that trying to predict what she'd do was pointless. Sure. He led her to the bay where her car sat, hood already open. The engine gleamed. He'd cleaned it while he was at it, unable to help himself. Vivien leaned over, examining the new timing belt with genuine interest. So this is what failed, she said. Yeah, see the tensioner here? Keeps the belt at the right pressure. When the belt snapped, it threw off the timing of the whole engine. Valves and pistons were trying to occupy the same space. That sounds bad. It is. You're lucky you weren't going faster when it happened. Could have caused serious damage. Vivien traced the path of the belt with one finger, careful not to touch anything. How long should this last? 100,000 miles, give or take. Depends on driving conditions. Mason pointed to the service sticker on the doorframe. Your last timing belt service was supposed to be at 90,000. You're at 112. I didn't know. That's what service schedules are for. I don't really pay attention to those things. I just drive the car until something breaks. Mason winced. That's an expensive way to own a vehicle. I'm realizing that now. She straightened up, brushing her hands together even though she hadn't touched anything dirty. What do I owe you? $785, like I said. Vivien pulled out a checkbook, wrote with the kind of neat handwriting they probably didn't teach anymore, tore off the check and handed it over. Mason glanced at it, then looked again. She'd written it for 1,000. This is too much. Consider it a tip for the excellent work and the hot chocolate. I don't take tips. Then consider it an overpayment and keep the change. Mason tried to hand the check back. Vivien crossed her arms, clearly not planning to accept it. They stood there in a silent standoff until Ruby's voice floated down from upstairs. "Just take it, Dad. Don't be weird." Vivien laughed. "I like her." "She's a menace," Mason said, but without heat. He folded the check and put it in his pocket, making a mental note to donate the difference somewhere, maybe the library fund. They were always asking for money. "So," Vivien said. She seemed reluctant to leave, which was strange. Her car was fixed, transaction complete. There was no reason to stay. "Ruby mentioned you used to design buildings. She talks too much. She's proud of you." Mason didn't know what to do with that. Pride seemed like the wrong emotion for someone who'd walked away from everything he'd built. It was a different life. "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes." The honesty surprised him. "Mostly I don't let myself think about it." "That sounds exhausting." "It's manageable." Vivien walked over to the wall where his old blueprints were still tacked up, the ones he kept meaning to take down. She studied them with the kind of focus Mason associated with people who actually understood what they were looking at. "These are really good. The library especially. I love how you handled the natural light." "You know architecture?" "I know buildings. My father's company does a lot of commercial development." She pointed to a detail in the corner. "This is clever, using the structural columns as part of the aesthetic instead of hiding them. Form follows function." "Louis Sullivan." "You know Sullivan?" "I took some design classes in college before I switched to business." Her expression shifted, something complicated crossing her face. "Another life I didn't finish?" They were both quiet for a moment, standing in front of blueprints from a past that felt like it belonged to someone else. Mason became aware of how close Vivien was standing, could smell her perfume or shampoo or whatever it was that made her smell like something expensive and clean. He stepped back, creating distance. "You should probably test drive it. Make sure everything feels right." "Good idea." They went outside. The afternoon was clear, last week's storm completely forgotten by the weather. Vivien got in her car, started it, listened to the engine with the kind of attention that suggested she was actually hearing what Mason had taught her to listen for. "Sounds different," she said through the open window. "Sounds right." Before it was compensating for the bad timing. She put it in gear, drove a slow circle around the lot, came back and parked. "It's perfect. Thank you. Just doing the job." "You do it well." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the compliment. He was good at fixing things. That wasn't special. That was just competence. Vivien got out but didn't move toward leaving. Instead, she leaned against the car, looking at the garage, the surrounding woods, the general isolation of the place. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" "I have Ruby." "It's not what I asked." It wasn't. And the real answer was yes. Sometimes the loneliness felt like it would crush him. But he'd chosen this. Chosen isolation over the alternative of being around people who knew him before, who'd ask questions or worse, offer sympathy. This was safer. Lonelier, but safer. "I like the quiet," he said instead. "I get that. The city's overwhelming sometimes. Too many people. Too many expectations." Vivien looked at him. "Is that why you left? The expectations?" "Part of it." "What was the other part?" Mason almost told her. Almost explained about Sarah, about the accident that wasn't anyone's fault, but felt like his anyway, about the way he couldn't look at a blueprint without seeing all the ways structures could fail, people could fail, he could fail. But Ruby was somewhere upstairs probably listening, and this woman was basically a stranger, and some stories didn't get told just because someone asked nicely. "Complicated," he said. "That word again." "It's a good word." "It's an evasion." "Maybe." Vivien smiled, but it looked sad. "Fair enough. I use it too." She pushed off from the car. "I should go. I have papers to grade." "On a Thursday afternoon?" "Teaching's a full-time job even when you're only doing it temporarily." "Why temporarily?" "Because my father expects me to come back to the company eventually. This is just my rebellion phase, 20 years late." 30's not too late to rebel. Try telling that to Warren Langford. She said the name like it should mean something. Mason's expression must have shown his ignorance because she added, "Langford Industries. We build things, hotels, office complexes, residential towers." Something clicked in Mason's memory. Langford Industries. He'd heard of them, worked adjacent to them once or twice back in his Meridian days. Big money, bigger influence. The kind of company that shapes skylines. "You're that Langford," he said. "I'm a Langford, Warren's daughter, currently disappointing him by teaching 5th grade in a town he's never heard of." "Why Millbrook?" "Because it's not the city. Because nobody here cares who my father is. Because I wanted to see if I could do something that mattered in a way that had nothing to do with profit margins." She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Turns out I'm not very good at it, but at least I'm trying." Mason understood that. The trying. The wanting to be someone different than who you were built to be. "Teaching's hard. So is fixing cars, I imagine. Cars make sense. They follow rules. See, kids don't." "No, they really don't." They smiled at each other, a moment of shared understanding. Then Vivien's phone buzzed and the moment broke. She checked it, made a face. "I really do need to go. Parent conference in an hour." "Good luck." "Thanks." She opened her car door, then paused. "Mason, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "The blueprints in your garage. Do you ever think about going back? To engineering, I mean." "No." "That was fast. It's not an option." "Why not?" "Because I can't trust myself anymore," Mason thought. "Because the last time I designed something, I was so focused on the work that I didn't notice my wife getting sicker. Because I came home late too many nights, missed too many signs, and by the time I paid attention, it was too late." Out loud he said, "I'm happy here." Vivien looked at him like she knew he was lying but wasn't going to push. "Okay. Well, if you ever change your mind, I know people who are always looking for good engineers. I'll keep that in mind." She got in the car, started it, gave him a small wave through the window. Mason watched her drive away, the expensive vehicle disappearing down the access road until it was just him and the woods and the quiet again. Ruby appeared at his elbow. "You didn't ask her out." "I'm not going to ask her out." "Why not? She likes you." She was being polite. "Dad, I'm 9, and even I can tell she likes you." Ruby crossed her arms, a perfect miniature of exasperation. "She came back. To get her car. She stayed to talk. People make small talk." "Not like that, they don't." Mason started walking back to the garage. Ruby followed, relentless. "You're allowed to like someone, you know. Mom wouldn't want you to be alone forever." The words hit harder than Ruby probably meant them to. Mason stopped walking, took a breath. "Your mother has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with it. You stopped living when she died. Ruby, it's true. We moved out here, and you act like we're hiding from something. Maybe you are, but I'm not." Her voice cracked slightly. "I miss having people around. I miss having friends who don't live 30 minutes away. I miss you being happy." Mason crouched down to Ruby's level, saw tears threatening in her eyes. His chest felt tight. "I'm happy." "You're lying." "I'm content." "That's not the same thing." No, it wasn't. Mason pulled Ruby into a hug, felt her arms wrap around his neck. She was getting bigger. Soon she'd be too old for this, too cool for dad hugs. The thought made him ache. "I'm doing the best I can," he said quietly. "I know. But maybe your best could include other people sometimes." They stayed like that for a minute, Mason breathing in the scent of Ruby's strawberry shampoo, trying to figure out when his daughter had gotten wise enough to see through him. Finally he stood, keeping one hand on her shoulder. "How about pizza for dinner?" he offered. "You're changing the subject." "I'm absolutely changing the subject." Ruby wiped her eyes, managed a small smile. "Can we get the one with the weird cheese?" "Gorgonzola is not weird. It smells like feet. Delicious feet." "That's disgusting, Dad." They went inside, the moment diffused if not resolved. Mason called in the pizza order, Ruby set the table, and they fell into their evening routine like the conversation outside hadn't happened. But it had happened, and Mason couldn't quite shake it. Maybe your best could include other people sometimes. Later, after pizza and homework and Ruby's bedtime, Mason sat at his small desk in the corner of the living room and pulled out Vivien's check. $1,000 for a $700 job. He should tear it up, send her a new invoice for the correct amount. That would be the professional thing to do. Instead, he found himself looking at her signature, the confident loops of her handwriting. Vivien Langford, billionaire, teacher, woman who looked at his old blueprints like they still mattered. He opened his laptop, something he rarely did anymore, and typed her name into the search bar. The results were extensive. Vivien Langford, daughter of Warren Langford, heir to a commercial real estate empire worth billions. There were photos, her at charity galas, at groundbreakings, standing next to her father looking polished and perfect, and completely unlike the woman who'd sat in his garage drinking cheap hot chocolate. One article was from 6 months ago. Langford heiress steps back from family business. The piece was short, speculative. Vivien had apparently left her position as VP of Development to pursue personal interests. The business press seemed confused. People didn't walk away from that kind of power unless something was wrong. Mason closed the laptop. Whatever Vivien's story was, it wasn't his business. She'd gotten her car fixed. She'd leave a nice review if he had a website, which he didn't. Their paths would diverge, and that would be that. His phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Hi, it's Vivien. Ruby mentioned you do consulting work sometimes. I might have a project that could use your expertise. No pressure. Just thought I'd ask. Mason stared at the message. Consulting work. He hadn't done consulting in 3 years. Had told everyone from his old life that he wasn't available, wasn't interested, wasn't that person anymore. How did Ruby even know to mention it? His daughter was a menace. He should text back a polite no. Should maintain the boundaries he'd spent 3 years building. Should not let this woman into his life any more than she already was. He typed, "What kind of project?" The response came quickly. "A school. The building's old, having structural issues. District can't afford the big firms, but I thought maybe someone with your background could assess it. Again, no pressure. I can find someone else if you're not interested." A school, structural issues, the kind of assessment that was probably straightforward, that wouldn't require him to design anything new. Just evaluate what existed. The kind of work he used to do in his sleep. The kind of work he'd sworn off. Mason set down the phone without responding. He could feel the pull of it, the old familiar need to solve problems, to understand systems, to make things right. But that path led to caring too much, to letting work consume him, to missing what mattered while he focused on what didn't. He'd learned that lesson. Learned it in the worst possible way. The phone buzzed again. "Sorry, that was presumptuous. Forget I asked. Thanks again for fixing the car." Before he could talk himself out of it, Mason typed, "Send me the details. I'll take a look." He hit send before his brain could override his fingers. Then he sat there staring at the phone like it had betrayed him. "You're texting her." Ruby stood in the doorway in her pajamas, looking smug. "I thought you were asleep." "I was thirsty." She got water from the kitchen, took her time drinking it. "So you're helping with her school?" "Maybe. Just an assessment." "That's good. You should use your brain for more than just cars." "My brain works fine on cars." "You know what I mean." Ruby set down her glass. "You're happier when you're solving real problems. Cars are real problems." "You know what I mean," she said again, and headed back to her room before Mason could argue. He looked at his phone. Vivien had sent a thank you text, said she'd email details in the morning. Mason typed back a simple "sounds good" and set the phone down. Tomorrow, he'd probably regret this. Probably realize he'd made a mistake. Agreed to something that would pull him back into a world he'd left behind for good reasons. But tonight, sitting in his quiet apartment above the garage, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Interested. In a problem. In a project. Maybe in a person. He didn't examine that thought too closely. Some things were better left alone. But as he got ready for bed, checking on Ruby one more time, making sure the garage was locked up tight, Mason caught himself thinking about structural assessments and old buildings and what it might be like to use his engineering degree for something besides changing oil, and about dark eyes that saw too much, and a voice that asked uncomfortable questions, and the way Vivien had looked at his blueprints like they were worth something. The email arrived at 7 the next morning. Detailed, thorough, with photos of the school building and descriptions of the issues. Cracks in the foundation, settling in the east wing, concerns about load-bearing walls that might have been compromised during a renovation 15 years ago. The kind of assessment that would take a few hours on site, maybe a day to write up properly. The kind of work that was exactly in his wheelhouse. Mason read through everything twice, already forming hypotheses about what was causing the problems. Foundation settlement, probably, exacerbated by poor drainage. The cracks in the photos showed a pattern consistent with differential movement. Fixable, most likely, but it would require proper analysis to be sure. He was halfway through drafting a response when he realized he was excited. Actually excited, in a way he hadn't been since before Sarah died. His mind was working, turning over problems, seeing solutions. It felt like waking up after a long sleep. It also felt like betrayal. Mason closed the laptop and went downstairs to the garage. Friday morning, which meant he had the Anderson sedan coming in for brake work and the Miller truck that needed a new catalytic converter. Real work. Simple work. Work that didn't require him to think about anything except the mechanical problems in front of him. But his mind kept drifting to the school, to load calculations and soil reports, and whether the original foundation had been properly engineered for the building's weight, to Vivien, who'd somehow known exactly what kind of project might draw him out. Ruby came down around 9, still in pajamas, carrying her tablet. "Did you email her back yet?" "How do you know she emailed?" "Because you're being weird and distant, which means you're thinking about something that makes you uncomfortable." Mason put down the wrench he'd been holding. "You're too smart." "I know, so did you?" "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because I'm scared," Mason thought. "Because if I say yes to this, I might say yes to other things. Because the walls I've built feel safe, even if they're also lonely." "Just want to make sure I have time for it," he said instead. "You have time. You always finish the car stuff by lunch on Fridays." "It's still a big commitment." Ruby looked at him with those serious eyes, the ones that made her seem much older than 9. "Dad, it's okay to do things that make you happy. Mom would want that." There it was again. The invocation of Sarah, of what she would have wanted. The problem was Ruby was probably right. Sarah would have hated seeing him like this, would have kicked his ass for hiding in the woods and pretending he was content. But Sarah wasn't here to kick his ass or offer opinions or do any of the things she would have done. She was gone, and Mason was left trying to figure out how to live in a world that no longer included her. "I'll think about it," he told Ruby. She sighed, but didn't push. "I'm making pancakes. You want some?" "Since when do you make pancakes?" "Since I found a recipe on YouTube. They might be terrible." They were, in fact, slightly terrible. Too thick, unevenly cooked, but Ruby had made them herself and she was proud. So Mason ate 3 and told her they were great. She saw through him, but appreciated the effort. After breakfast, Mason went back to the garage and opened the laptop again. Vivien's email was still there, waiting. He read through it a third time, paying attention to details he'd missed before. The school served about 300 students, mostly from lower-income families. The building was 70 years old. The district had already gotten quotes from 2 structural firms, both of which had come in at prices they couldn't afford. This wasn't just a problem to solve. It was kids who needed a safe building, teachers who needed to work without worrying about cracks widening in the walls. A community that deserved better than deferred maintenance and budget constraints. Mason started typing before he could talk himself out of it. "Vivien, I can do the assessment. I'll need access to the building, preferably on a weekend when school's not in session. Also, any original blueprints or structural documents you have. My rate is $150 per hour for consulting work. Let me know what works for your schedule." He read it over, deleted the rate, typed it again. He was undercharging and he knew it, but this was a school district. They didn't have money to burn. He hit send before he could revise it again. The response came back within minutes. "That's perfect. The building manager can meet us tomorrow, Saturday, at 10 a.m. If that works, I'll bring all the documents I can find. Your rate is more than fair. Thank you." Us. She'd said us, like she was planning to be there. Mason typed back, "See you tomorrow." Then he sat there for a long moment, wondering what he'd just committed to. An assessment, yes. A few hours of work, maybe a day total, including the write-up. But also time with Vivien, conversation, the risk of getting drawn into something more complicated than a simple consulting job. "You said yes," Ruby said from the stairs. "I said yes." She came down and hugged him, sudden and tight. "I'm proud of you. It's just an assessment. It's more than that, and you know it." Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just a job. A way to make some extra money and help out a school in need. Either way, Mason had agreed to it now. No backing out. He spent the rest of Friday trying not to think about Saturday, which meant he thought about it constantly. That night, he dreamed about structures failing, buildings collapsing, people trapped in rubble. The old nightmare. The one that had plagued him after Sarah's death when everything felt unstable and dangerous. He woke at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, and couldn't get back to sleep. By the time Saturday arrived, Mason was exhausted and wired in equal measure. He dressed carefully, work clothes but clean ones, boots that weren't covered in oil. Ruby watched him with barely concealed amusement. "It's not a date," he said. "I didn't say anything." "You're thinking it loudly." "I'm thinking you look nice." "That's allowed." Mason grabbed his assessment kit, laser measure, notebook, camera, moisture meter, a few other tools he'd kept from his engineering days. Everything fit in a canvas bag that had Meridian Design Group stamped on the side. He should have thrown it out years ago, but he'd never quite managed to. The drive to town took 15 minutes. The school was in the older part of Millbrook, a brick building that had probably been impressive in the 1950s, but now looked tired. Vivien's car was already in the parking lot. She got out as Mason pulled up, wearing jeans and a jacket that looked expensive but practical. "Morning," she said. "Hey, thanks for doing this. I know it's probably not exciting work for someone with your background. It's fine. Structural assessments are straightforward." They walked toward the building. An older man in coveralls was waiting by the entrance. The building manager, presumably. He introduced himself as Frank, shook Mason's hand with a grip that spoke of decades of manual labor, and unlocked the door. "Been having problems for about 2 years, Frank said as they entered. "Started with small cracks, then they got bigger. District keeps saying they'll fix it, but money's tight." The interior smelled like every school Mason had ever been in. Floor wax, old books, institutional cleaning products. They were in the main hallway, and even in the dim weekend lighting, Mason could see the cracks Frank was talking about. They ran up the walls, following patterns that told a story if you knew how to read it. Mason pulled out his laser measure and started taking readings. Vivien stayed quiet, watching but not interfering. Frank answered questions about the building's history, renovations, any recent changes. Mason moved methodically through the hallway, documenting everything, his mind already building a 3-dimensional model of the structure. The east wing was worse. The cracks here were wider, showing more displacement. Mason pressed his moisture meter against the wall, frowned at the reading, moved to another location. High moisture content, probably from poor drainage like he'd suspected. Water was getting into the foundation, causing the soil to expand and contract, creating differential settlement. "This is the wing they renovated 15 years ago?" he asked. "Yeah," Frank confirmed, added 2 classrooms, updated the electrical. "Did they do any foundation work?" "Not that I know of." Mason knelt down, examining where the wall met the floor. The gap was subtle but present, showing the building was moving. He took photos from multiple angles, made notes, moved to the next section. Vivien followed at a distance, not speaking, just observing. They were in the east wing for over an hour. Mason mapped every crack, took moisture readings at dozens of points, examined the ceiling for signs of stress. The building was telling him its story, and the story wasn't good. The renovation had added weight without properly addressing the foundation. Years of water infiltration had weakened the soil. The structure was slowly pulling itself apart, but it was fixable. That was the good news. Expensive, but fixable. "I need to see the basement," Mason said. Frank led them down a narrow staircase that probably violated modern code. The basement was exactly what Mason expected. Low ceiling, concrete floor, the smell of damp and age. The foundation walls showed the same stress patterns as above, but more pronounced. Mason examined the mortar between bricks, found it crumbling in places, saturated with moisture in others. He was measuring a particularly bad section when Vivien finally spoke. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that you shouldn't ignore it, not bad enough that the building's in immediate danger." "Can it be fixed?" "Yeah, but it won't be cheap." "How not cheap?" Mason did quick mental math, factoring in drainage work, foundation stabilization, crack repair, waterproofing. "Rough estimate? 150 to 200,000. Vivien's face fell. "The district doesn't have that kind of money. Most districts don't. That's why buildings like this sit until they become emergencies." Mason pointed to the worst section of wall. "You see this pattern? That's progressive failure. Right now it's slow. But if you get a wet winter and the soil saturates, it could accelerate. At some point, the differential settlement becomes enough that you start getting structural issues beyond cosmetic cracks. Meaning the building becomes unsafe. Vivien was quiet for a long moment, staring at the crumbling foundation like she could will it to repair itself. There has to be a way to fix this. There is. It just costs money. What if we phased it? Did the most critical work first? Mason considered it. You could. Address the drainage immediately, that's the root cause. Stabilize the worst sections of foundation. That might buy you a few years to fundraise for the rest. How much for phase 1? Maybe $60,000. And that's if we use the most cost-effective methods and don't run into surprises. $60,000. Vivien pulled out her phone, typed something. Okay, we can work with that. We? The district, I mean. I'll talk to the superintendent. Mason doubted the district had $60,000 lying around either, but that wasn't his problem. His job was to assess the building and provide options. What they did with that information was up to them. They spent another hour going through the building. Mason documented everything, took enough photos that he'd have no trouble writing the report. Frank showed them the roof, which had its own issues, but nothing immediately critical. By the time they finished, it was past noon, and Mason's notebook was full of observations. I'll have a full report to you by Wednesday, he told Vivien as they stood in the parking lot, with recommendations and cost estimates. Thank you. Really, this is incredibly helpful. Just doing the assessment. It's more than that. You're giving these kids a chance at a safe school. Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Building should have been maintained properly from the start. But it wasn't, and now you're helping fix it. That matters. They stood there in the parking lot, and Mason felt the weight of Vivien's attention. She was looking at him the way she had in his garage, like she was seeing something he didn't want to show. I should get back, he said. Ruby's probably burned down the apartment by now. She seems pretty capable. Too capable. It's terrifying. Vivien smiled. I'd like to meet her properly sometime. Maybe bring her by the school when it's in session. The kids would probably love talking to someone their age who's so smart. Mason started to make an excuse, then stopped. Ruby would actually love that. She'd been complaining about not having friends nearby. A visit to the school, meeting other kids, that wasn't a threat. That was just good parenting. Yeah, okay, she'd like that. Great. Vivien's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, made a face. My father. He's persistent, if nothing else. You don't have to answer. I know, but if I don't, he'll just keep calling. She answered with a professional tone that was completely different from how she'd been speaking to Mason. Hi, Dad. No, I'm not in the city. Yes, I'm still teaching. We've talked about this. Mason waved goodbye and got in his truck, giving her privacy. As he drove away, he could see her in the rearview mirror, pacing the parking lot, having what looked like an increasingly tense conversation. The woman had her own complications, her own version of running away from expectations, of trying to be someone different than who the world wanted her to be. Mason understood that better than he wanted to admit. Ruby was waiting when he got home, eager for details. Mason filled her in on the school assessment, the foundation issues, the potential solutions. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood more about structural engineering than most adults. So you're going to help fix it? She asked. I'm going to give them a report. What they do with it is up to them. But you want them to fix it. Of course I want them to fix it. It's a school, and you like having a project. Mason couldn't deny that. The assessment had felt good, had engaged parts of his brain that had been dormant for too long. He'd forgotten what it was like to look at a problem and see solutions, to use his training for something meaningful. He'd also forgotten how much it hurt to care. That night he started on the report, laying out findings in careful detail. The work consumed him in a way that was both familiar and unsettling. Hours passed without him noticing. Ruby had to call him twice for dinner, and when he finally went to bed, his mind was full of foundation calculations and drainage solutions and structural reinforcement strategies. It felt like coming home. It felt like betrayal. Mason lay in the dark, listening to the quiet sounds of the building settling around him, and wondered if you could ever really leave your old life behind, or if it just waited patiently for you to stop running. The report took Mason 3 days to complete, not because it was complicated, but because he kept revising it. Tuesday night, he rewrote the executive summary twice, trying to strike the right balance between honest and alarming. Wednesday morning, he recalculated the cost estimates, double-checked his measurements, questioned his own conclusions. By Wednesday afternoon, he was staring at 22 pages of technical analysis and wondering if he'd forgotten how to write for normal humans. Ruby found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts covered in red pen marks. "You're overthinking it," she said. "I'm being thorough. You've rewritten the same paragraph 4 times. I watched you." Mason rubbed his eyes. The words were starting to blur together. "It has to be right." "It is right. You've checked everything 3 times. Ruby pulled up a chair, looked at the report upside down with the ease of someone who'd grown up reading blueprints on her father's desk. "This is good work, Dad. Stop second-guessing yourself. When did you become the adult? Somebody has to be." Mason managed a tired smile. Ruby was right. The report was solid. He was just nervous about sending it, about Vivien reading it, and seeing how much effort he'd put into something that was supposed to be a simple assessment. The report revealed more than just structural issues. It revealed that he still cared, still had the capacity to invest himself in work that mattered. That vulnerability felt dangerous, but he'd committed to having it done by Wednesday, and it was already 4 in the afternoon. Mason made one final pass, caught 2 typos and a formatting inconsistency, then converted the whole thing to PDF and attached it to an email. "Vivien, attached is the structural assessment for Millbrook Elementary. Let me know if you have questions. Best, Mason." He read it 3 times, deleted best, and replaced it with nothing, then put best back because ending with just his name seemed cold. Finally, he closed his eyes and hit send before he could revise it again. "There," Ruby said. "Was that so hard?" "Yes." "You're being dramatic." "I'm being realistic." His phone rang 10 minutes later. Vivien's name on the screen. Mason stared at it for 2 rings before answering. "That was fast," he said. "I've been refreshing my email for an hour." Vivien's voice sounded different on the phone, sharper, more energetic. "Mason, this is incredible. The level of detail, the recommendations, the phased approach. This is exactly what we needed. It's just an assessment. It's a roadmap. The superintendent is going to love this." Papers rustled in the background. "I'm already looking at the drainage recommendations. These seem really feasible. The drainage is critical. Fix that first and you stop the progression. And the foundation stabilization in phase 2? That's the permanent solution. But the drainage buys you time to fundraise." Vivien was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, become more careful. "What would it take to get you to oversee the repair work?" Mason's stomach dropped. "I'm not a contractor." "No, but you could supervise. Make sure whoever we hire does it right." "Vivien, I know what you're going to say. You don't do that kind of work anymore. You're happy fixing cars. But Mason, this is 300 kids who deserve a safe building, and I don't trust anyone else to make sure this gets done properly. There are plenty of qualified engineers who will charge the district 5 times what you charged for the assessment and won't care half as much about getting it right." Vivien's tone had gone persuasive, the voice of someone used to negotiating. "I saw how you worked at the school. You weren't just documenting problems. You were already solving them in your head." She wasn't wrong. Mason had spent the last 3 days thinking about optimal drainage solutions, foundation reinforcement techniques, cost-effective materials. His brain had engaged with the problem in ways that felt both natural and terrifying. "I can't," he said. "Can't or won't?" "Both." "Why?" "Because getting involved means caring," Mason thought. "Because caring means risk. Because the last time I let myself get invested in my work, I stopped paying attention to everything else, and my wife died, and I'll never forgive myself for that." "I'm not that person anymore," he said instead. Vivien was quiet. Then, "Okay, I understand. The assessment is more than enough. Thank you for doing it." The disappointment in her voice made Mason's chest ache. He wanted to explain, wanted to make her understand that this wasn't about the work or the kids or her. It was about protecting himself from the person he used to be, the one who gave everything to his career and lost everything that actually mattered. But explaining required vulnerability he didn't have access to, so he just said, "You're welcome. Good luck with the fundraising." They ended the call. Mason sat at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen where the PDF of his report was still open. 22 pages of careful analysis, detailed recommendations, solutions to problems he'd spent days thinking about. Work that mattered. Work he was walking away from. Ruby appeared in the doorway. "You said no." "I said no. That's dumb." "Ruby, it is. You want to do it, I can tell." Want and should are different things. "Why shouldn't you?" Mason closed the laptop, too tired for this conversation. "Because some doors are better left closed." "That doesn't mean anything." "It means I made a choice 3 years ago, and I'm sticking with it." Ruby crossed her arms, looking mutinous. "Mom wouldn't want you to stop living because she died." The words landed like a punch. Mason stood up, needing to move, needing to be anywhere but under his daughter's too perceptive gaze. "Your mother doesn't get a vote. She's not here." "Exactly. She's not here. But we are. And you're wasting your life in a garage because you're scared." "I'm not scared." "You're terrified. Of everything. Of caring about anything except cars and me." Ruby's voice cracked. "And sometimes I think you're even scared of caring too much about me." That stopped Mason cold. He turned to look at his daughter, saw tears in her eyes, and felt something break inside his chest. "Ruby, Forget it." She wiped her eyes, angry now. "Stay in your garage. Fix your cars. Pretend you're happy. I'm going to my room." She left. Mason stood in the kitchen, listening to her door close with more force than necessary, and wondered when exactly he'd become the kind of father his daughter had to work around instead of rely on. He didn't sleep well that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cracks in the school's foundation, heard Ruby's voice saying, "You're wasting your life," felt the pull of work that mattered competing with the safety of isolation. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, promising rain. Mason went through his routine mechanically. Coffee, check the garage, start on the day's work. He had 2 jobs scheduled, both routine. The kind of work he could do without thinking, which was good because his brain refused to focus. Around 10, Ruby came downstairs. She'd clearly been crying more, her eyes puffy and red. Mason's heart contracted. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hi." They stood in awkward silence. Mason wanted to apologize, but didn't know what to apologize for. Being broken? Being scared? Being unable to be the father Ruby deserved? "I'm sorry about last night," Ruby said finally. "I shouldn't have said that stuff." "You were honest." "I was mean." "You were both." Mason set down the wrench he'd been holding. "And you were right." Ruby looked up, surprised. "About what?" "About me being scared, about wasting my life." The admission hurt, physically hurt, like pulling shrapnel from a wound. "I don't know how to fix it." "Maybe you start by saying yes to things. It's not that simple." "Why not?" Mason sat down on his work stool, suddenly exhausted. "When your mom died, I was working on this huge project, a mixed-use development downtown, 30 stories, my biggest design. I was so focused on it that I missed things. She told me she was tired, that she wasn't feeling well, and I said it was probably stress, told her to rest. I was too busy with deadlines and structural calculations to notice she was getting worse." Ruby had gone very still, listening with the intensity she brought to everything important. "By the time I paid attention, really paid attention, it was too late. The cancer had spread. Stage 4. Mason's voice cracked. "The doctors said if we'd caught it earlier, maybe, but we didn't. I didn't. I was too busy being brilliant at my job." "Dad, that wasn't your fault. It was my fault. I was her husband. I should have seen it. You're not a doctor." "I'm someone who's supposed to pay attention to the people he loves." Mason looked at his daughter, this remarkable kid who'd somehow survived him as a parent. "After she died, I couldn't go back to it. Couldn't look at blueprints without thinking about everything I'd sacrificed for them. Couldn't work on a project without wondering what I was missing while I focused on technical problems that didn't actually matter." Ruby came over, climbed onto the stool next to him. "But you didn't miss anything with me. You've been here every day." "Because I'm terrified of making the same mistake twice." "So you just stopped? Stopped doing work you're good at? Stopped having a life? Stopped everything?" "I kept you. That was enough." "But it's not, Dad. Not for you and not for me." Ruby took his hand, her small fingers gripping tight. "I need you to be happy, and you're not happy just fixing cars." Mason wanted to argue but couldn't. She was right. He was competent at the garage work, maybe even good at it, but it didn't engage him the way engineering had. It was safe and small and manageable, which was the point, but it also felt like slowly suffocating. "I don't know if I can do it," he said quietly. "Care about work like that again. Risk losing focus." "You wouldn't. You're different now." "How do you know?" "Because I know you." Ruby leaned against him, and Mason put his arm around her shoulders. "You check on me every night. You ask about my day every morning. You read all my school stuff, even though I know you hate reading long things. You pay attention now." "That's because you're all I have." "No, it's because you learned. You got better at the thing you were bad at." She looked up at him. "People can be good at more than one thing, Dad. You can be good at being my father and good at engineering." Mason wanted to believe her, wanted to think he could find some kind of balance, could engage with meaningful work without losing himself to it. But the fear was still there, solid and immovable, a wall he'd built brick by brick over 3 years of careful isolation. His phone buzzed. Text from Vivien. "The superintendent wants to move forward with Phase 1. Can we meet to discuss contractors? No pressure if you're not interested in being involved." Mason stared at the message. Ruby was watching him, waiting. "What would I even do?" he asked. "You'd supervise. Like she asked. Make sure the repairs get done right. That's a lot of hours. A lot of commitment. You have time. The garage is slow this month anyway." It was slow. Summer always was. Mason could probably manage both if he was careful, if he set boundaries, if he didn't let himself get consumed by the school project, if he was willing to try. He typed back, "I can recommend some contractors. Meet Friday afternoon to go over options." The response came immediately. "Perfect. Thank you, Mason." Ruby was grinning. "You said yes. I said I'd recommend contractors." That's still saying yes to being involved. It's barely involved. It's a start. She hugged him hard. "I'm proud of you." Mason held his daughter and tried to ignore the anxiety crawling up his spine. This was just consultation, just using his expertise to help select qualified people. That was manageable, controlled. Not the same as getting emotionally invested. He almost believed it. Friday afternoon, Mason drove to the school, his truck bed loaded with samples of drainage materials he'd somehow acquired during the week. He told himself he was just being prepared, but the truth was, he'd spent 3 evenings researching optimal solutions and calling suppliers for quotes. The project had gotten under his skin. Vivien was waiting in the parking lot with an older woman in a pantsuit who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Chen, the district superintendent. She had the exhausted competence of someone fighting budget battles and bureaucracy daily. "Mr. Drake, your report was extremely helpful," Dr. Chen said, shaking his hand with a grip that meant business. "The school board approved Phase 1 funding last night. We're ready to move forward." That was fast. "We've been waiting for someone to give us actionable information instead of just expensive quotes. You did that." She pulled out a folder. "I have 3 contractor bids here. All came in under your estimate, which makes me suspicious." Mason took the folder, flipped through the bids. 2 were clearly lowball offers designed to get the job, then add change orders later. The third was more realistic, but still missed some critical elements. "None of these are adequate," he said. Dr. Chen's face fell. "That's what I was afraid of. The first 2 will do sloppy work, and the third doesn't understand the scope properly." Mason pointed to specifics in each bid. "See here? They're planning to address drainage with basic grading. That won't handle the water volume you're getting. You need a proper French drain system." "Can we ask them to revise?" "You can, but if they didn't understand the requirements from my report, they're not the right contractors." "So what do we do?" Vivien asked. She'd been quiet until now, watching the exchange. Mason hesitated. What he was about to suggest crossed the line from consultation to involvement. But looking at these inadequate bids, thinking about 300 kids in a building that would continue to deteriorate if the work wasn't done right, he couldn't help himself. "I can put together a proper bid package. Detailed specifications, material requirements, scope of work. Make it clear enough that contractors can't lowball or misunderstand." "That would be amazing," Dr. Chen said. "What's your rate?" "Same as the assessment, $150 an hour." "Done. How long will it take?" "Week, maybe 2. Mr. Drake, I'm going to be honest with you. Dr. Chen's expression had gone serious. We need someone who cares about this building as much as you obviously do. The bid package will help, but what we really need is someone to supervise the work. Make sure it's done to your standards. There it was. The ask Mason had known was coming. He could feel Vivien's attention on him, could sense Ruby's voice in his head saying, "Just say yes." "I'm not a licensed contractor," he said. "We're not asking you to do the work, just oversee it. Make sure whoever we hire doesn't cut corners. That's still a significant time commitment. We'll pay you fairly. And honestly, Mr. Drake, I don't think we can afford not to have you involved. These kids deserve better than the usual half measures we get." Mason looked at the school building, at the cracks he'd spent days analyzing, at the foundation problems he'd already started solving in his head. Then he looked at Vivien, who was trying not to appear too hopeful and failing. "If I do this," he said slowly, "I need to set clear boundaries. I have other obligations, my work at the garage, my daughter. I can't let this consume me." "Of course," Dr. Chen said immediately. "And I need full authority over technical decisions. If a contractor wants to substitute materials or change methods, they clear it with me first." "Absolutely. And if at any point I think I can't give this the attention it needs, I'm out. No arguments, no guilt trips." "Agreed." Mason took a breath. This was insane. He was about to commit to exactly the kind of project he'd sworn off, the kind that required expertise and attention and emotional investment. But Ruby was right. He was better at balance now. He'd learned to pay attention to what mattered. Maybe he could do both. "Okay," he said. "I'll supervise the repairs." Vivien's face lit up. Dr. Chen looked like she might hug him. Mason felt equal parts terrified and alive. They spent the next hour going over details. Timeline, budget, materials. Mason found himself sketching drainage layouts on the back of one of the inadequate bids, explaining soil mechanics and water management to an audience that actually seemed interested. It felt good, uncomfortably good. When Dr. Chen left to handle district business, Mason and Vivien walked the building perimeter. He wanted to check his drainage calculations against the actual slope, make sure his recommendations would work with the existing topography. "Thank you for saying yes," Vivien said, as Mason measured grade changes with a level. "You're persistent. It's a family trait. My father would approve, even if he doesn't approve of anything else I'm doing." "Still fighting with him about the teaching?" "Fighting implies dialogue. Mostly, he just sends passive-aggressive emails about wasted potential." She watched Mason work for a moment. "He doesn't understand why I'd walk away from the company, why anyone would choose less money, less power, less prestige." "But you get it." "I'm starting to. This," she gestured at the school, at Millbrook generally, "feels more real than anything I did at Langford Industries. We develop these massive projects, move millions of dollars around, and I'd think, who is this actually helping? The answer was usually wealthy investors getting wealthier." Mason marked another measurement in his notebook. "So you want it to matter differently?" "Exactly. Though I'm not sure I'm succeeding. The kids tolerate me, but I don't think I'm a very good teacher." "Why not?" "I don't know how to connect with them. I understand lesson plans and curriculum standards, but the actual human part? I'm terrible at it." "You connected with Ruby." "Ruby's different. She's—" Vivien paused, searching for words. "She sees the world like we do, in systems and patterns. Most kids don't." "Maybe you're just teaching the wrong age group. Maybe I'm just not cut out for it." Vivien sat down on the school's front steps, looking discouraged. "My father thinks I'm having some kind of crisis, a phase I'll grow out of." Mason finished his measurements and joined her on the steps. "Is he right?" "I don't know, maybe. Or maybe I'm just realizing that the life I was supposed to want doesn't actually fit." She looked at him. "You understand that. You walked away from engineering." "I ran away from engineering. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Walking away is a choice. Running away is fear." "And which one was I doing?" Mason considered the question. "I think you were walking. I was definitely running." They sat in comfortable silence. The afternoon had turned warmer, clouds breaking up to reveal blue sky. Mason found himself relaxing, the anxiety that had been his constant companion starting to ease. "Can I ask you something?" Vivien said. "Sure." Why did you really say yes to supervising the repairs? Because the bids were inadequate and the building needs proper attention. That's the technical answer. Mason knew what she was asking. Why now? Why this project? Why risk engaging with work he'd spent 3 years avoiding? My daughter told me I was wasting my life, he said finally. She was right. I've been so focused on not making old mistakes that I forgot how to actually live. That sounds hard. It is, and it's probably going to be harder. But staying stuck was killing me slowly, so at least this is different. Vivien smiled. Well, I'm glad you're unstuck. These kids are going to benefit from having someone who actually cares working on their building. You care. I care about the idea. You care about the execution. That's different. She wasn't wrong. Mason had already started obsessing over drainage pipe diameter and aggregate specifications in ways that probably weren't healthy. But it felt right, using his brain for something complex and meaningful instead of just routine maintenance. His phone rang. Ruby's number. Hey kiddo, everything okay? Dad, the Andersons called. Their car broke down again. They're pretty upset. Mason closed his eyes. The Anderson sedan, the one he'd just done brake work on last week. What's wrong with it? They said the brakes are making a grinding noise. Tell them to have it towed in. I'll look at it tonight. They sound really mad. I'll handle it. Be home in an hour. He hung up, already running through possibilities. He'd replaced the brake pads properly, checked the rotors, bled the lines. If something had failed this quickly, it was either a defective part or he'd missed something. Neither option was good. Problem? Vivien asked. Customer with a comeback. Brake job I did last week apparently didn't take. Does that happen often? Never. Which means I either made a mistake or got a bad part. Mason stood, gathering his tools. I need to get back. Of course. Thanks again for agreeing to supervise the school repairs. I'll have the bid package ready in a week. Mason drove home faster than he should have, anxiety replacing the earlier calm. He didn't make mistakes on brake jobs. Brakes were critical, were safety, were the kind of thing he triple-checked. If he'd missed something, if his focus had been split because he was thinking about school foundations and drainage systems, no, he wouldn't go there. Not yet. The Anderson sedan arrived on a flatbed an hour later. Mr. Anderson got out looking thunderous. I thought you knew what you were doing, he said without preamble. Could have killed my wife, brakes failing like that. Let me look at it, Mason said calmly. I'll figure out what happened. You better, and I want a refund if you messed something up. Mason jacked up the car, pulled the wheel, examined the brake assembly. What he saw made his stomach drop. The brake pads he'd installed were worn down to nothing, not just worn, destroyed. Metal on metal grinding, but that was impossible. He'd installed new pads a week ago. They should have lasted months. He pulled the other wheel. Same story. Both front brake assemblies destroyed. Well? Mr. Anderson demanded. Mason's mind was racing through explanations. Defective pads that had disintegrated? Contamination on the rotors that had eaten through the material? Some kind of hydraulic failure that had caused the pads to drag constantly? Then he saw it. The caliper slide pins. He'd greased them during the job, standard procedure. But one was seized, completely frozen. That would cause uneven pad wear, but not this fast. Unless... He checked the other caliper. Also seized. This wasn't his mistake. The pins had been fine when he'd serviced them. But they'd failed catastrophically after, probably because they were corroded internally, and his cleaning had just temporarily freed them up. They'd re-seized almost immediately, caused the pads to drag, generated heat, destroyed everything. It's the caliper slide pins, Mason said. They seized up after I serviced them. So you admit you messed up? I didn't mess up. The pins were corroded. I cleaned and greased them, which is proper procedure, but they were too far gone. They needed to be replaced. So why didn't you replace them? Because they were functioning when I did the work. I recommended caliper replacement in the initial estimate, but you declined it to save money. Mr. Anderson's face went red. Don't try to blame this on me. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm explaining what happened. Mason kept his voice level. The brake pads I installed were correct. The work was done properly, but the underlying caliper issue caused premature failure. I can replace the calipers now along with new pads and rotors. At what cost? Parts and labor, probably $600. You've got to be kidding me. You just charged me $300 last week. Last week was brake pads. This is calipers, pads, and rotors because the seized pins destroyed everything. This is robbery. Mason took a breath, fighting down frustration. Mr. Anderson, I can show you the original estimate where I recommended caliper replacement. You chose the cheaper option. That was your call. But the consequence is that the calipers failed and now the repair is more expensive. I want a second opinion. That's your right. But the car's not drivable until this gets fixed. Mr. Anderson looked like he wanted to argue more, but his wife put a hand on his arm. Let's just get it fixed, she said quietly. We need the car. They left the sedan, still angry but resigned. Mason watched them go, then turned to find Ruby standing in the garage doorway. That wasn't your fault, she said. Doesn't matter. They think it was. But it wasn't. You told them to replace the calipers. I know. Mason started disassembling the brake system, removing the destroyed components with more force than necessary. But now they're going to tell everyone in town that I did shoddy work. That's how it goes. Ruby watched him work for a while, then said quietly, Are you worried you made a mistake because you were thinking about the school? The question hit harder than Mason wanted to admit. No, the brake job was fine. I checked everything. But you're wondering. I'm always wondering. That's the problem. Mason sat back on his heels, looking at the destroyed brake assembly. Every time I let myself care about something else, I worry I'm going to drop the ball somewhere important. But you didn't drop the ball. The part failed. This time. Dad, you can't live like that. Second-guessing everything, assuming you'll mess up if you're not 100% focused on one thing. Why not? I've got evidence that's exactly what happens. Ruby came and sat next to him on the garage floor, something she hadn't done in years. Mom died because she got cancer, not because you were working. The cancer would have happened whether you were home every night or not. But if I'd noticed earlier, you're not a doctor. You couldn't have known. Ruby's voice was fierce. And you're not psychic. You can't predict when car parts are going to fail or when people are going to get sick. You can just do your best. Mason looked at his daughter. When had she gotten so wise? And felt something crack open in his chest. The guilt he'd been carrying, the certainty that he'd failed Sarah, that he'd fail again if he wasn't hyper-vigilant. Maybe it wasn't as solid as he'd thought. Your best is pretty good, Dad, Ruby continued. You're a great mechanic. You're going to be great at the school project. You just have to trust yourself. I don't know if I can. Then fake it until you can. Mason pulled her into a hug. This kid who'd somehow survived having him as her only parent. When did you get so smart? I've always been smart. You just don't always listen. They stayed like that for a moment, sitting on the garage floor surrounded by car parts and broken components and the general mess of trying to fix things that didn't want to stay fixed. Then Mason got back to work, replacing calipers and rotors and pads, doing the job right, because that's what he did. But Ruby's words stayed with him. Trust yourself. Do your best. Stop assuming disaster is always one distracted moment away. It was harder than it sounded, but maybe that was okay. The Anderson sedan was ready by Sunday. Mason called to let them know, braced for more anger. Instead, Mrs. Anderson answered and apologized. My husband talked to the mechanic who worked on the car before you, she said. He confirmed the calipers were a problem. We should have listened to your recommendation. I'm sorry we blamed you. It's okay. People get upset when car repairs cost more than expected. Still, you did good work. We'll pick it up this afternoon. They did, and Mr. Anderson even had the grace to look embarrassed as he paid the bill. Mason watched them drive away and felt the tension he'd been carrying release slightly. See, he told himself, you didn't mess up. Sometimes things just fail. He was starting to believe it. That week, Mason threw himself into the bid package for the school. He wrote specifications with obsessive detail, created drawings that showed exactly how the drainage system should be installed, researched contractors, and called references. The work consumed him in ways that would have terrified him a month ago, but Ruby was right there, checking in, making sure he ate lunch and didn't work past 10 at night. Balance. He was learning balance. Friday afternoon, he delivered the bid package to Dr. Chen. 40 pages of technical specifications, drawings, material requirements, and contractor guidelines. She looked through it with growing amazement. This is incredibly thorough, she said. That's the point. No room for misinterpretation. How much do we owe you? Mason had tracked his hours. 23, all told. At his rate, that was $34.50. But looking at Dr. Chen's face, at the obvious budget constraints, he found himself saying, call it $2,000. That's less than your rate. Consider it an investment in education. Dr. Chen smiled. The bids are due back in 2 weeks. Can you evaluate them? That's what you're paying me for. Walking to his truck, Mason felt lighter than he had in years. The work had been hard but satisfying. He'd used his brain, solved problems, created something useful, and Ruby was fine. The garage was fine. Nothing had fallen apart while his attention was elsewhere. Maybe he could do this after all. Vivien called that night. I heard about the bid package. Dr. Chen says it's brilliant. It's just thorough. That's what makes it brilliant. A pause. Listen, I know you're probably busy, but Ruby mentioned wanting to visit the school. Would you both like to come by next week? The kids would love meeting her, and I'd love showing you both what we're doing with the teaching side. Mason's first instinct was to say no. Too much involvement, too much connection, too much risk. But then he thought about Ruby's face when she'd asked about making friends, about Vivien's voice when she talked about wanting work that mattered, about the fact that saying yes to things was apparently his new philosophy. Yeah, he said. We'd like that. Tuesday afternoon? Around 2? We'll be there. After hanging up, Mason found Ruby in her room reading. We're visiting Vivien's school Tuesday. Ruby looked up, eyes wide. Really? Really? You wanted to meet kids your age, right? Yeah, but I didn't think you'd actually... She stopped herself. Thank you. You're welcome. Dad? Yeah? You're doing really good. With the trying thing. I'm proud of you. Mason's throat felt tight. Thanks, kiddo. But, Bo... He closed her door and went to his own room, sat on his bed, and let himself feel it. The fear and the hope and the terrifying possibility that maybe life could be bigger than what he'd allowed it to become. That maybe he could care about work and people and still keep the things that mattered safe. It was still scary, but it was also starting to feel possible. And for the first time in 3 years, possible felt like enough. Tuesday arrived with the kind of nervous energy that made Mason check his appearance 3 times before leaving the house. Ruby watched him with barely concealed amusement as he changed shirts for the second time. It's an elementary school, not a job interview, she said. I know that. Then why are you acting like you're meeting the president? Mason looked at his reflection, saw a man who hadn't cared much about his appearance in 3 years, suddenly worried about looking presentable. I'm not acting like anything. You changed shirts twice. The first one had a grease stain. So did the second one, just smaller. Ruby handed him a clean button-down from his closet. Wear this. You look nice in blue. He took the shirt, suspicious. Since when do you have opinions about my clothes? Since you started caring what you look like, which is recent and kind of weird, but also good, I guess. Mason changed into the blue shirt, hating that Ruby was right. It did look better. He was being ridiculous. This was just a school visit, a chance for Ruby to meet kids her age and for him to see Vivien's classroom. Nothing significant, nothing to be nervous about, except he was nervous. Had been since Vivien called to confirm yesterday. His hands felt clumsy as he tried to button his cuffs, and Ruby had to help with the left one. You really like her, Ruby observed. I barely know her, but you want to know her. Mason gave up trying to deny it. Maybe. Is that a problem? No, I like her too. Ruby grabbed her backpack, which she'd packed despite this not being an actual school day. She's smart, and she doesn't talk to me like I'm a little kid. Plus, she actually listens when people explain things. Those are good qualities. And she's pretty. You can admit that too. Ruby, what? She is. It's just an observation. They drove to Millbrook Elementary in comfortable silence. Ruby looking out the window with barely suppressed excitement. Mason trying to calm the anxiety humming under his skin. He hadn't been inside a school since Ruby's parent-teacher conferences last spring. Hadn't been around groups of people in general since he'd moved to the garage. The thought of walking into a classroom full of kids and teachers made his palms sweat. The parking lot was more crowded than it had been during his weekend visits. Cars of various ages and conditions, a couple buses, teachers hurrying from their vehicles with armfuls of papers and supplies. Mason parked in a visitor spot and sat for a moment, breathing. You okay? Ruby asked. Fine. Just haven't been around this many people in a while. We can leave if you need to. Mason looked at his daughter's face, saw both concern and hope there. She wanted this, wanted to meet other kids, wanted him to engage with the world, wanted things to be different than they'd been. He could do this for her. I'm good. Let's go. The school's interior smelled like every educational institution Mason had ever entered, floor wax and paper, and the particular scent of too many people in too small a space. The hallways were decorated with student artwork, bulletin boards covered in colorful displays about the solar system and the water cycle. Ruby's eyes went wide, taking it all in. Vivien met them at the main office, wearing professional clothes that somehow made her look both more authoritative and more uncertain. She smiled when she saw them, something genuine and warm that made Mason's anxiety ease slightly. You made it, she said. We did. Is this a bad time? Perfect time, actually. The kids just finished math and they're getting restless. She crouched down to Ruby's level. You ready to meet some very curious fifth graders? Ruby nodded, suddenly shy in a way she never was at home. They walked down the hallway, Vivien explaining the day's lesson plan. Something about ecosystems and food chains, concepts Ruby had probably mastered years ago, but would politely pretend to find interesting. Mason half listened, distracted by the building itself. Even without trying, his engineer's eye cataloged issues. Water stains on ceiling tiles, slightly uneven floor transition, a door frame that looked like it was pulling away from the wall. The foundation problems were affecting more than he'd initially thought. Vivien's classroom was at the end of the east wing, naturally. Room 112, with windows facing the problematic section of foundation. Inside, 23 kids in various states of attention turned to look at the visitors. Their curiosity was immediate and intense. Everyone, this is Ruby and her father, Mr. Drake, Vivien said. Ruby's 9, just like many of you, and she's going to hang out with us this afternoon. Mr. Drake is the engineer who's helping fix our building. A hand shot up immediately. Is the school going to fall down? No, Mason said, then reconsidered. Honesty mattered with kids. Not immediately, but it does have some problems that need fixing, which is why I'm here. What kind of problems? The foundation is settling unevenly. That causes cracks. Like the one by the reading corner? A girl near the window pointed to a visible crack in the wall. Exactly like that one. Suddenly he had their complete attention. 23 kids leaning forward, fascinated by structural failure in a way that was both encouraging and slightly concerning. Vivien looked amused. Maybe Mr. Drake could explain a little about how buildings work, she suggested. Since we're studying systems anyway. Mason hadn't prepared for this, hadn't expected to do any kind of presentation. But the kids were interested, and Vivien was looking at him with an expression that suggested she thought he could handle it, and Ruby was watching with pride. Okay, he said. Who can tell me what a foundation does? The next 30 minutes disappeared. Mason found himself explaining load paths and compression forces using metaphors about pizza and cafeteria trays. The kids got it immediately, started asking increasingly sophisticated questions about why buildings didn't just fall over and how engineers knew how much weight things could hold. Ruby contributed explanations when Mason got too technical, translating engineer speak into kid-friendly language. Vivien watched from the side of the room, occasionally interjecting to connect Mason's explanations to their science curriculum. But mostly, she just observed, and when Mason caught her eye once, she was smiling in a way that made him forget what he'd been saying for a solid 5 seconds. A boy in the front row raised his hand. So, you fix buildings for a job? Not exactly. I assess them, figure out what's wrong. Then other people do the actual repairs. But you used to design them, right? Miss Langford said you were an engineer. Mason glanced at Vivien, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I was. I designed commercial buildings, offices, libraries, that kind of thing. Why'd you stop? The question was innocent, just a kid's curiosity, but it landed hard. Mason was aware of Ruby watching him, of Vivien's stillness, of 23 children waiting for an answer that made sense. I needed to focus on other things, he said carefully. Being a single parent takes a lot of energy. My mom's a single parent, a girl with braids said. She says it's the hardest job in the world. Your mom's right. But you're doing engineering again now, for our school. Just a little, just enough to help. The bell rang, saving him from further explanation. Kids exploded into motion, packing up, chattering, heading for recess. Several stopped to thank Mason for the explanation. One asked if he could come back and talk about bridges, and two wanted to know if buildings ever fell down while people were working on them. Sometimes, Mason admitted to the last question, which is why we're very careful. When the classroom finally emptied, just Vivien, Mason, and Ruby remained. Ruby had already gravitated to the bookshelves, examining titles with the intensity she brought to everything reading related. "That was amazing," Vivien said. "You're a natural teacher." "I was just answering questions." "You made structural engineering accessible to 10-year-olds. That's a gift." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "They were good questions." They were. "You'd be surprised how many adults can't explain their expertise that clearly." Vivien started straightening desks. A nervous habit, maybe? "I struggle with it constantly, making things simple enough to understand without being condescending." "You're too hard on yourself," says the man who hid in the woods for 3 years because he thought he'd failed at everything. The observation was sharp enough to sting. Mason opened his mouth to argue, then realized she was right. Fair point. We're both working on it, being less hard on ourselves, I mean. Vivien finished with the desks, turned to face him fully. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you really agree to supervise the school repairs? And don't say it's because the bids were bad. I think there's more to it." Mason considered deflecting, giving her the safe answer. But standing in her classroom, having just spent 30 minutes being honest with a group of kids, deflection felt wrong. "Because my daughter told me I was wasting my life and she was right," he said. "Because I've been so scared of making mistakes that I stopped trying to do anything meaningful. Because when I looked at your school's foundation, I saw a problem I could actually solve, and that felt important." And maybe because you asked, and you seemed to think I could do it." He met her eyes. "I haven't had anyone believe in my abilities in a long time." It felt good. Vivien's expression softened. "I do believe in your abilities. You're brilliant at what you do. I'm competent. You're brilliant and you hide it because acknowledging it feels dangerous." She moved closer, just a step. "I understand that. I've been hiding too. From my father's expectations, from the life I was supposed to want, from the fact that I have no idea what I'm actually doing with my life." "You're teaching." "I'm playing at teaching. There's a difference." Vivien gestured around the classroom. "These kids deserve someone who actually knows how to reach them, not a billionaire's daughter having an identity crisis." "But you care about them." "Caring isn't enough. You need skill, patience, the ability to connect." She laughed, but it sounded sad. "You did in 30 minutes what I haven't managed in 6 months. Made learning feel exciting instead of like a chore." "That's just because it was new. Novelty helps." "No, it's because you're good at explaining complex things. You have a gift for it." They were standing close now, close enough that Mason could smell her perfume, could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. The classroom felt very small suddenly, very private despite being surrounded by tiny chairs and educational posters. "Dad?" Ruby's voice came from the reading corner. "Can we go to the playground? Ms. Langford said there might be kids out there." The moment broke. Mason stepped back, creating distance. "Yeah, of course." They headed outside, Ruby running ahead to where several kids were playing on the aging playground equipment. Mason made a mental note to check the structure's safety. Some of those supports looked questionable. He couldn't turn it off, the constant assessment of structural integrity. Everything was a potential failure point. Vivien walked beside him, hands in her pockets. "Sorry if that got weird in there." "It didn't get weird." "I was definitely making it weird." "You were being honest. That's different." They found a bench with a view of the playground. Ruby had already integrated herself into a group, playing some complicated game involving a ball and a lot of shouting. She looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way Mason hadn't seen since before Sarah died. "She's great," Vivien said, watching Ruby. "You've done an amazing job with her." "I've done an adequate job of not screwing up too badly." "Same thing, really. Parenting is just controlled chaos." "You don't have kids." "No, but I have a father who thinks parenting means controlling every variable and eliminating all uncertainty. Didn't work out great for either of us." Vivien stretched her legs out, seeming to relax incrementally. "He wanted me to be a certain type of person. Ambitious, ruthless, completely dedicated to the company. When I showed interest in other things, he saw it as failure." What kind of other things? Art, literature, philosophy, anything that wasn't directly related to profit margins and market share. She smiled, but it looked pained. I got a degree in business because that's what Langfords do, but I minored in urban studies, which drove him crazy. He thought it was a waste of time. Urban studies is what got you interested in education and community development and the way cities fail the people who need them most? Vivien gestured at the school building. Places like this, underfunded schools and working-class neighborhoods, they're canaries in the coal mine. When the foundation literally crumbles, it's because society stopped investing decades ago. Mason had never thought about it that way, but she was right. The school's structural problems were just symptoms of deeper systemic neglect. So you wanted to fix it. I wanted to do something that mattered, but I'm not sure I'm succeeding. You got the funding for repairs. That matters. Only because I could leverage my father's name and connections. I didn't earn it. Does it matter how you got it if the result is 300 kids in a safer building? Vivien considered that. I suppose not. I just wish I could contribute more than money and networking. You're contributing time, energy. You show up every day even though you're not good at it yet. Mason watched Ruby navigate the social dynamics of playground politics with surprising skill. That counts for something. Maybe. Vivien was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something embarrassing? Sure. I Googled you after the first time we met. Mason's stomach dropped. Yeah? There wasn't much. Some mentions in project credits from your Meridian days. A couple articles about buildings you'd worked on. Nothing personal. I'm not on social media. I noticed. It's refreshing, actually. Everyone in my world performs their lives online. You just exist. I hide, you mean? Maybe both. Vivien turned to look at him directly. The library you designed, the River West branch, I drove past it last weekend. It's beautiful. The way you use natural light, the open sight lines. You can tell someone thoughtful designed it. Mason felt heat creep up his neck. That was a team effort. Your name was lead architect on the credits. I did the structural design. The aesthetics were collaborative. Don't do that. Do what? Minimize your contribution. You're allowed to be proud of your work. But pride felt dangerous. Pride meant caring, and caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. Mason had spent 3 years building walls against exactly this kind of exposure. A commotion on the playground drew their attention. Ruby had apparently said something that made a boy twice her size angry. He was looming over her, aggressive, and Mason was halfway off the bench before he saw Ruby's expression, calm, analytical, completely unafraid. I'm just saying the game would work better with different rules, Ruby said, loud enough for Mason to hear. The current system incentivizes hoarding instead of cooperation. The boy blinked, clearly thrown by vocabulary he probably didn't encounter often. What? You're keeping all the good balls. That's not fair to the younger kids. So? So it makes the game less fun for everyone, including you, because eventually people will stop playing. The boy looked around, seemed to realize Ruby was right. Several smaller kids had already wandered away, bored by their exclusion. His posture shifted, defensive but less aggressive. What do you think we should do? He asked. Ruby outlined a system of rotation and turn-taking that was surprisingly sophisticated. The boy listened, nodded, then actually implemented her suggestions. Within minutes, the game had reorganized itself along more equitable lines, and everyone looked happier. Mason sat back down, slightly stunned. Vivien was laughing quietly. She just revolutionized playground politics, Vivien said, using systems thinking and negotiation. That's Ruby. She sees inefficiency and has to fix it. She gets that from you. I fix broken cars. She fixes broken social structures. Both are valuable. Vivien watched Ruby integrate back into the game, now playing by rules she'd helped establish. She's going to do amazing things when she grows up. If I don't screw her up first. You won't. You're already not screwing her up, which is more than a lot of parents manage. They sat in comfortable silence, watching kids play. The afternoon sun was warm, the kind of early summer weather that made you remember why you lived through winter. Mason found himself relaxing in increments, the constant anxiety that usually accompanied being around people starting to ease. This is nice, he said without thinking. What is? This, sitting here, watching kids play, having a conversation. You don't do this often.
Never, really. It's been just me and Ruby for so long. We don't do social things. Why not? Mason considered his answer. Easier to control the variables when it's just the two of us. Fewer chances for things to go wrong. That sounds lonely. It is sometimes, but it's safe. Vivien shifted to face him more fully. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. I might not answer. Fair enough. She took a breath. Do you ever think about dating, meeting someone?
The question caught Mason completely off guard. No, not really. I mean, sometimes, but it's not practical.
Why not? Because I'm a mess. Because I have a kid. Because the last relationship I had ended with my wife dying, and I don't know if I can handle caring about someone like that again. The honesty surprised even him. Vivien didn't look shocked, just thoughtful. That makes sense, she said quietly. Grief is complicated. You sound like you know.
My mother died when I was 12. Cancer, like your wife. My father never dated again. He threw himself into work, became this single-minded machine. I used to think it was devotion to her memory, but now I think it was just easier than risking that kind of pain again. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, but I understand the fear. Opening yourself up to someone, knowing you could lose them. She looked at him. But you're doing it anyway. With this school project, with being here today, you're risking caring about things. That's different. That's work. Is it? You care about those kids having a safe building. You cared about teaching them this afternoon. You're letting yourself be involved. Mason didn't have a good argument for that. She was right. He was caring, despite his best efforts not to. About the school, about the kids, about Vivien herself if he was being honest. The recess bell rang. Kids groaned in universal protest, then started trudging back to the building. Ruby jogged over, slightly breathless and clearly exhilarated.
That was fun, she announced. Can we come back? We'll see, Mason said. That means yes. It means we'll see.
Ruby rolled her eyes but was smiling.
Miss Langford, thank you for inviting us. Your students are really smart.
Thank you for coming. You made quite an impression on the playground. Someone had to fix their distribution system. It was really inefficient. Vivien laughed. Of course it was. They walked back to the building together, Ruby chattering about the kids she'd met and the games they'd played. Mason listened with half his attention, the other half hyper-aware of Vivien walking beside him, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. In the parking lot, Ruby climbed into the truck while Mason lingered outside. Thanks for today, he said. Ruby needed that. What about you? Did you need it? Maybe. I'm not sure yet. Vivien smiled. Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you came, both of you. The kids really did ask good questions. They liked you. You made engineering seem accessible instead of intimidating. It's not intimidating. It's just applied physics. See? You do that thing where you make complex subjects sound simple. That's a gift. Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I should go. Ruby has homework. Of course. I'll email you when the contractor bids come in. Yeah, should be next week sometime. They stood there awkwardly, neither quite ready to leave. Mason became aware of Ruby watching them from the truck, probably making observations he'd hear about later. Mason, Vivien said. Yeah? Would you want to have dinner sometime? Not as a meeting about the school, just dinner. Mason's brain short-circuited. Was she asking him on a date? That couldn't be right. Billionaires didn't ask mechanics out. People like Vivien didn't date people like him. I know it's probably weird, Vivien continued, filling the silence. And you can absolutely say no. But I like talking to you, and I thought maybe we could do that without the pretense of work stuff. Mason's mouth didn't seem to be working properly. I have Ruby. I can't just leave her to go to dinner. She could come too, if you wanted. Or we could do lunch instead when she's occupied. I'm flexible. She was giving him outs, ways to decline without it being awkward. But standing there in the school parking lot, watching Vivien look simultaneously hopeful and terrified, Mason found he didn't want an out. Dinner would be good, he heard himself say. Maybe this weekend. Vivien's face lit up. Really? Yeah, Ruby can come.
She'd probably enjoy it more than I will anyway.
I doubt that.
Vivien pulled out her phone. Saturday? There's a decent Italian place in town. Nothing fancy.
Saturday works.
They exchanged details, confirmed the time, stood there smiling at each other like idiots until Ruby honked the truck horn.
I should go, Mason said.
Right. Yes. Saturday. Saturday. He got in the truck. Ruby was vibrating with excitement. You have a date, she said. It's dinner. It's a date. She asked you out and you said yes, and that's a date. You're coming too. That doesn't make it not a date. It makes it a family date. Ruby's grin was enormous. I knew you liked her. I barely know her. You want to know her. That's how it starts. Mason drove home, half listening to Ruby's analysis of the social dynamics at the school, the other half of his mind occupied with the fact that he'd just agreed to a date, an actual date, with a woman who was smart and kind and way out of his league. He was terrified. He was also, if he was being honest, a little excited. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the conversation, analyzing every word, wondering if he'd misunderstood. Maybe Vivien was just being friendly. Maybe she felt obligated because he was working on the school. Maybe she pitied him. But no, the look on her face when he'd said yes had been genuine relief. She'd wanted him to say yes, which meant this was real, which meant he needed to not completely mess it up. Ruby appeared in his doorway around midnight, backlit by the hallway light. You're still awake. Can't sleep. Because you're freaking out about Saturday. I'm not freaking out. Dad, I can hear you thinking from my room. She came and sat on the edge of his bed. It's going to be fine. You don't know that. I know you're a good person who makes people laugh when you forget to be nervous. I know Vivien already likes you, otherwise she wouldn't have asked. And I know that even if it goes badly, which it won't, you'll survive. When did you become a relationship expert? I watch a lot of YouTube. Mason laughed despite himself. That's terrible advice. It's better than no advice, which is what you have. Ruby patted his arm. Just be yourself. She already knows you're awkward and overthink everything. She likes you anyway. I'm not that awkward. Dad, you changed shirts 3 times this morning. Point taken. Ruby stood to leave, then paused. You know it's okay to be happy, right? Mom would want you to be happy. The words hit hard, the way truth often did. Mason nodded, not trusting his voice. Good. Now go to sleep. You look terrible when you don't sleep. She left. Mason lay in the dark, thinking about Sarah, about loss and grief, and the terrifying prospect of caring about someone again, about Vivien's smile and Ruby's confidence, and the fact that life kept moving forward whether you were ready or not. Eventually he slept, dreams filled with structural failures and classroom discussions and dark eyes that saw too much. Friday brought the contractor bids. Mason reviewed them at his desk while Ruby did homework nearby, his red pen making increasingly aggressive marks. 2 were still inadequate, barely different from the first round. But the third, from a company called Sterling Construction, was solid. They'd understood the specifications, priced things accurately, included proper materials. Mason called their references, got glowing reports, checked their licensing and insurance. This one's good, he told Dr. Chen when he called with his assessment. Sterling Construction. They know what they're doing. Excellent. Can we move forward? I'd recommend it. They can start in 2 weeks if you're ready. We're ready. Thank you, Mason. Really, this wouldn't be happening without you. After hanging up, Mason felt a surge of satisfaction. The project was moving forward. The school would get fixed properly. He was making a difference. It felt good, terrifyingly good. Saturday arrived with Mason's anxiety at peak levels. He'd changed clothes twice already, and it wasn't even noon. Ruby watched from the couch, eating cereal and providing commentary. The blue shirt, she said. Definitely the blue shirt. The blue shirt is too dressy. It's dinner, not the garage. Some dress is appropriate. Mason looked at his reflection, saw a man who looked simultaneously hopeful and terrified. When had he become this person? 3 years ago, he'd been confident, successful, sure of his place in the world. Now he was nervous about a simple dinner. But it wasn't simple. Nothing about this was simple. The restaurant Vivien had chosen was in downtown Millbrook, a family-run Italian place that had been there for 40 years. Mason had driven past it countless times but never gone in.
When they arrived, Vivien was already there, sitting at a table by the window. She stood when she saw them, smoothing her dress nervously. She'd dressed up too. That made Mason feel slightly better. "Hi," she said. "Hey, you look nice." "So do you." Ruby cleared her throat. "Should I just sit down, or are you two going to stand here being weird all night?" That broke the tension. They laughed, sat down, opened menus. The conversation started awkwardly, both of them hyper-aware of Ruby's presence and what it meant that she was there. But gradually they relaxed into it, talking about the school project and Ruby's observations about playground dynamics, and nothing particularly deep or meaningful. It was nice, normal, the kind of thing regular people did. Halfway through dinner, Ruby excused herself to the bathroom. The moment she left, the dynamic shifted. Mason and Vivien looked at each other across the table, suddenly alone. "This is going okay, right?" Vivien asked. "I'm not completely bombing." "You're not bombing. I'm probably bombing." "You're not. You're just quiet." "I'm always quiet." "I like that about you. Most people talk too much." Mason smiled. "Most people would say I don't talk enough." "Most people are wrong." They fell into silence, but it felt comfortable. Mason found himself looking at Vivien, really looking, and seeing not just the put-together exterior, but the uncertainty underneath. She was nervous too. That helped. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "Why did you ask me to dinner, really?" Vivien set down her fork, considering her answer. "Because I like you. Because talking to you is easy in a way most conversations aren't. Because you see me as a person, not as Warren Langford's daughter or a billionaire or whatever else people usually see. I see you as someone who's trying really hard to do something meaningful. Same thing I see in you." She met his eyes. "We're both running from our old lives, trying to figure out who we are without the things that used to define us. I don't know, it feels significant. Or we're both just disasters who happened to meet." "Maybe that too." Ruby returned, sliding back into her seat with perfect timing. "Did I miss anything?" "Nothing important," Mason said. "You're both terrible liars." They finished dinner, declined dessert even though Ruby lobbied hard for it, and walked outside into the warm evening. The sun was setting, painting downtown Millbrook in gold light. It was beautiful in a way Mason had stopped noticing years ago. "This was really nice," Vivien said. "Can we do it again?" "Yeah, I'd like that." "Next time without the chaperone?" Ruby snorted. "I'm standing right here." "Sorry." "Next time with a different chaperone?" "Next time just us," Mason said, surprising himself with the boldness. "If that's okay." Vivien's smile was bright enough to hurt. "That's very okay." They said goodbye, Mason and Ruby heading to the truck, Vivien to her car. Mason was aware of his daughter watching him with barely concealed glee. "So?" she said once they were driving. "So what?" "So did you have fun?" Mason thought about it, the nervousness, the awkward moments, the surprising ease of conversation. "Yeah, I did. Are you going to see her again?" "Apparently." "Good. You need more people in your life besides me." "You're plenty. I'm 9. I'm not equipped to be your entire social circle." Mason laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Point taken." When they got home, Ruby went straight to bed, exhausted from the excitement. Mason sat on the couch, replaying the evening, trying to identify the exact moment when it had shifted from terrifying to enjoyable. His phone buzzed, text from Vivien. "Thank you for tonight. I had a really good time." Mason stared at the message, composing and deleting several responses before settling on, "Me too. Thanks for asking." The response came quickly. "Same time next week?" "Yeah, that works." "It's a date then, an actual date, no chaperones." Mason smiled at his phone like an idiot. "Looking forward to it." He meant it. Despite the fear, despite the risk, despite everything that could go wrong, he was looking forward to it. Maybe Ruby was right. Maybe he was allowed to be happy. Maybe life could be bigger than the small, safe world he'd built. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But sitting in his quiet apartment, thinking about dark eyes and easy conversation and the possibility of something new, Mason decided terrifying might be okay, as long as he didn't run from it this time. The second date happened on a Wednesday, which felt deliberate. Not a weekend date with all its implications, just a Wednesday dinner at a place that served burgers, and had terrible lighting. Mason appreciated the low stakes, even as his hands shook slightly pulling into the parking lot. Vivien was waiting by the entrance, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked soft enough to make him forget how to form sentences. She smiled when she saw him, something uncertain but genuine, and Mason felt his anxiety downshift from panic to manageable nervousness. "You made it," she said, almost turned around twice. "But you didn't."
Ruby threatened to disown me if I chickened out. Vivien laughed. She's a good kid. She's terrifying.
Inside, they got a booth in the corner, away from the main crowd. The menu was simple: burgers, fries, shakes. Nothing that required discussion or decision-making beyond basic preferences. Mason ordered without thinking, his brain too occupied with the fact that he was on an actual date with a woman who made him feel like a teenager again. "So," Vivien said once the waitress left, "how's the garage?" "Busy. Had 3 comeback jobs this week." "Is that normal?"
Not usually, just bad luck. Mason fiddled with his napkin.
"How's teaching?" "Still struggling? Had a kid throw a book at another kid yesterday. My conflict resolution skills are apparently non-existent." "What did you do?" "Panicked internally, then made them both write apologies. Pretty sure I handled it wrong." "Did they apologize?" "Eventually." "Then you handled it fine." Vivien smiled, but it looked tired. "You're generous." "The truth is I have no idea what I'm doing most days. I keep waiting for someone to realize I'm completely unqualified and ask me to leave." "You care about the kids. That counts for something." "Does it? I'm not sure caring is enough when you're bad at the actual job." Mason understood that feeling intimately, the gap between wanting to do something well and actually being competent at it. "You could quit. Go back to your father's company." "I could. He emails me job offers weekly." Vivien's expression shifted, became harder. "But that feels like admitting defeat. Like everything I've been trying to prove about being more than just Warren Langford's heir was wrong." "What are you trying to prove?" "That I matter outside of money and connections. That I can contribute something real to the world instead of just moving capital around." She paused. "Sounds naive when I say it out loud." "It sounds honest." "Same thing, maybe." Their food arrived. Mason focused on his burger for a moment, buying time to organize his thoughts. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that would make Vivien feel less alone in her uncertainty. But meaningful wasn't his strength. Direct was easier. "I think you're being too hard on yourself," he said. "You got a school funded for critical repairs. You show up every day for kids who need stability. You're learning a new skill that doesn't come naturally. That's not nothing. It's not enough. It's more than most people do." Vivien ate a fry, considering. "Is that how you justify the garage work? That it's better than nothing?" The question landed harder than she probably intended. Mason set down his burger. "I justified the garage by telling myself I was protecting Ruby, keeping things small and manageable so I couldn't fail catastrophically. And now? Now I'm realizing small and manageable also means small and limited. Ruby deserves more than a father who's hiding from life." "You're not hiding anymore." "I'm trying not to. It's hard. Everything worth doing is hard." Vivien met his eyes. "That's what my mother used to say. Right before she died, when she knew the treatment wasn't working, she told me that the hard things are what make us human, that avoiding difficulty is avoiding life." Mason felt something crack open in his chest. "I spent 3 years avoiding difficulty." "So did I. Different methods, same result." They sat with that for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them. Mason had never talked to anyone like this, not even Sarah. His wife had been practical, solution-oriented, always moving forward. Vivien felt like someone who understood being stuck. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Always. I'm terrified of this, of you, of caring about someone again." Vivien's expression softened. "I'm terrified too. Different reasons probably, but same result." "What are you afraid of?" "That I'm not actually capable of real connection. That I'm too damaged by my upbringing, too shaped by wealth and isolation to be a real person." She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "My therapist says I have attachment issues stemming from losing my mother and having an emotionally unavailable father. Basically, I'm a walking cliché." "You're not a cliché."
I'm a billionaire's daughter having an identity crisis and dating a working-class single father. That's definitely a cliché. We're not dating. We've had 2 dinners. Semantics, Vivien smiled. But okay, we're having dinners, multiple dinners. Is that less terrifying? Marginally. They finished eating, the conversation drifting to safer topics. The school repairs, Ruby's latest observations about social inefficiency. The fact that Mason's truck needed new brake pads, but he kept putting it off. Normal things, easy things, the kind of talk that felt like building foundation. Afterward, they walked through downtown Millbrook, the evening cool but not cold. Vivien pointed out buildings her father's company had considered developing but rejected as insufficiently profitable. Mason pointed out structural issues in old storefronts that nobody had bothered to fix. They were both seeing the same town through completely different lenses. Do you ever miss it? Vivien asked. The engineering work, I mean, designing instead of just assessing. Every day. But missing something doesn't mean you should go back to it. Why not? Because I wasn't good at the balance. Work consumed me. I was brilliant at designing buildings and terrible at noticing my wife was dying. The words came out raw, unfiltered. I can't trust myself to do both. Vivien stopped walking. They were in front of the old courthouse, its columns showing age and weather damage. Mason, you can't blame yourself forever. Why not? It was my fault. Cancer was your fault? Not paying attention was my fault. You're not omniscient, you're human. She turned to face him fully. Humans make mistakes. We miss things. We fail people we love. That doesn't mean we stop trying. It means we should be more careful. Or it means we learn and adapt and do better next time. Vivien's voice had gone intense. My mother died and my father decided the solution was to never be vulnerable again. He built this empire, made billions, controlled every variable he could. And you know what he got? A daughter who barely knows him. A life so rigid and controlled that nothing real can penetrate it. That's different. Is it? You did the same thing. Built walls, eliminated risk, controlled your environment. The methods were different, but the motivation was identical. Mason wanted to argue but couldn't. She was right. He'd been doing exactly what Warren Langford had done, choosing safety over connection, control over vulnerability. So what's the alternative, he asked. Risk it. Care about things even though they might hurt you. Let people in even though they might leave. Vivien stepped closer. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's necessary. They stood on the empty street, close enough that Mason could feel the warmth of her, could see the vulnerability in her eyes that matched his own fear. He wanted to kiss her. Wanted it so badly his hands were shaking, but terror held him frozen. Vivien made the choice for him. She leaned in, slowly enough that he could have pulled back, and kissed him softly. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before she stepped away, watching his reaction. Was that okay? She asked quietly. Mason's brain had short-circuited. Yes, that was okay. Good, because I've wanted to do that since you fixed my car in the rain. That was months ago. I know, I'm slow. Mason laughed, surprising himself. The tension broke, replaced by something warmer. We're both slow. Maybe that's good. Maybe slow is how you do this right. They walked back to their cars, not holding hands, but close enough that their shoulders bumped occasionally. Mason felt lighter than he had in years, like some weight he'd been carrying had finally shifted. Same time next week? Vivien asked when they reached the parking lot. Yeah, or sooner, if you want. Sooner sounds good. Mason drove home with his mind racing, replaying the kiss, the conversation, the terrifying exhilaration of letting someone past his defenses. Ruby was still awake when he got back, sitting on the couch with her tablet. You're smiling, she observed. I had a good time. Did you kiss her? Ruby? You did. I can tell. She looked pleased. Good. You need more good things. When did you become the adult? Someone has to be. Mason sat next to his daughter, this remarkable kid who'd somehow stayed intact despite everything. How are you doing? Really? I know I've been distracted with the school and Vivien and everything. Ruby considered the question seriously. I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. You're happier, which makes me happier. And I like seeing you do engineering work again. You're good at it. You don't mind sharing my attention? Dad, you check on me like 12 times a day. I'm not exactly neglected. She leaned against him. Besides, I like Vivien. She's smart and she treats me like a person instead of a kid. If you're going to date someone, she's a good choice. I'm not sure we're dating. You're definitely dating. That's what multiple dinners and kissing means. Mason couldn't argue with that logic. Okay, we might be dating. Good. Now, can we watch something before bed? My brain is tired from all this adult conversation. They watched an episode of some show Ruby liked about kids solving mysteries. Mason barely paid attention, his thoughts occupied with Vivien and the school project and the general upheaval of his carefully controlled life. But sitting there with Ruby, he realized the upheaval didn't feel catastrophic. It felt like growth. The school repairs started the following Monday. Mason arrived early to meet the Sterling construction crew, his assessment kit in hand and his engineer brain fully engaged. The foreman, a weathered man named Carlos, shook his hand with the grip of someone who'd spent decades in physical labor. Your specs are thorough, Carlos said, reviewing the plans. Most engineers give us garbage to work with. This is detailed. I want it done right. That's clear. We'll make sure it is. Mason spent the first day just observing, making sure the crew understood the drainage layout and foundation stabilization approach. Carlos ran a tight operation. Everyone knew their role, worked efficiently, asked questions when things were unclear. By the end of the day, the excavation for the French drain system was complete and properly graded. Vivien stopped by during her lunch break, picking her way carefully around the construction site. Mason watched her approach, still slightly amazed that she was real, that this was happening. "Looks official," she said, gesturing at the work. "Getting there. They're good. Careful. Because you're supervising. Because they care about doing quality work. I'm just here to make sure they don't cut corners." They walked the perimeter together, Mason explaining the drainage system in probably too much detail. But Vivien listened like she actually cared, asked questions that showed she was following along, pointed out connections to urban planning concepts he'd never considered. "You should teach," she said after one particularly detailed explanation about soil mechanics. "I'm not a teacher." "You are, actually. You just don't realize it." Vivien stopped near the east wing. "The way you break down complex ideas, make them accessible without dumbing them down, that's teaching. That's just explaining." Same thing. Mason shook his head but didn't argue. They'd reached the section where the foundation cracks were worst, now exposed by excavation. The damage looked worse than Mason had initially assessed, but still fixable. Everything was fixable with enough patience and the right approach. "Can I ask you something?" Vivien said, her tone shifting. "Sure. What happens after this project is done? After the school's fixed and there's no professional reason for us to keep seeing each other?" The question caught Mason off guard. "I hadn't thought that far ahead." "I have. I tend to overthink things." "What conclusion did you reach?" "That I want to keep seeing you. That this," she gestured between them, "feels important, but I'm not sure what you want." Mason looked at the exposed foundation, at the visible damage that would soon be repaired, and realized the metaphor was almost too obvious. Sometimes you had to expose the broken parts before you could fix them. "I want to keep seeing you too," he said. "It terrifies me, but I want it." "Why does it terrify you?" "Because I'm going to mess it up. I'm going to get too focused on work and miss something important, or I'm going to be too careful and not give enough, or I'm going to—" He stopped, aware he was spiraling. "You're going to be human and imperfect, and sometimes you'll make mistakes," Vivien finished. "Same as everyone, same as me." "That doesn't scare you?" "It terrifies me, but the alternative is worse." "What's the alternative?" "Never trying. Staying safe and isolated and alone." She took his hand, the gesture simple but weighted with meaning. "I've been alone most of my life, Mason. Rich and powerful and completely isolated. I don't want that anymore." Mason squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of human connection, the risk and reward of letting someone matter. "I don't want it either. So we try. We mess up. We figure it out together." "What about your father, the company, all the expectations?" Vivien's expression hardened. "My father made his choices. I'm making mine. If he can't accept that, it's his loss." "You sound certain." "I'm not, but I'm trying to be." She looked at him. "You help with that, seeing you choose to engage with life again, to risk caring about things. It makes me braver." "I'm not brave. I'm barely functional most days. You're here. You're supervising repairs you don't have to supervise. You're dating someone when it would be easier to stay isolated. That's brave. Mason wanted to argue, to list all the ways he was still broken and scared. But standing there with Vivien, watching construction workers fix a building's literal foundation, he realized maybe brave didn't mean fearless. Maybe it just meant moving forward despite the fear. The repairs took 3 weeks. Mason was on site most days, checking work, approving materials, ensuring everything matched specifications. The garage suffered slightly. He had to turn away some jobs, extend timelines on others. But Ruby helped where she could, and customers were surprisingly understanding when he explained he was working on the school. Vivien visited regularly, bringing coffee and conversation. They fell into an easy rhythm, work discussion morphing into personal talk, professional boundaries blurring into something more intimate. Mason found himself looking forward to her visits, planning his day around when she might stop by. Ruby visited the site once, asked 100 questions about drainage gradients and foundation reinforcement, then proceeded to reorganize the construction crew's material storage system for better efficiency. Carlos was so impressed he offered her a summer job when she turned 16. "I'm 9, Ruby pointed out. "I'll remember in 7 years." The final inspection happened on a Friday. Dr. Chen, Frank the building manager, Vivien, and Mason walked through the completed work. The drainage system was invisible now, buried and functional. The foundation showed new mortar in the repaired cracks, reinforcement where needed. Everything looked good. Better than good. Professional, permanent, done right. "This is incredible," Dr. Chen said, examining the work. "The building already feels more stable. Give it a full wet season to really test the drainage," Mason cautioned. "But structurally, it's solid. The Phase 2 work can wait a few years if needed. Thanks to you, we actually have the breathing room to fundraise properly." She shook his hand warmly. "You've made a real difference here, Mason. These kids are safer because of your work." Mason felt the compliment land differently than usual. Not deflected or minimized, just accepted. "Thanks. I'm glad I could help." After Dr. Chen left, Vivien lingered. They walked through the empty hallways, school was out for summer now, and ended up in her classroom. The space looked different without kids in it, quieter and somehow smaller. "I'm not coming back next year," Vivien said abruptly. Mason stopped examining a wall crack. "What?" "To teaching. I'm not coming back." She sat on her desk, looking around the room. "I gave it a year. I tried. But I'm not good at it, and the kids deserve someone who is. You could get better with practice." "I could, but I don't want to practice. I don't want to spend years becoming adequate at something I don't love." Vivien met his eyes. "I want to do work that uses my actual skills. Urban development, community investment, the intersection of capital and social need. That's what I'm good at." "So you're going back to your father's company?" "Hell no. I'm starting my own. A development firm focused on underserved communities. Projects like this school. Places that need investment but can't get it through traditional channels." Mason felt pride swell in his chest. "That's ambitious." "It's terrifying, but also right." She smiled. "You helped me realize that. Watching you rediscover engineering, seeing how alive you get when you're solving real problems, it made me think about what makes me feel that way. And it's not teaching fifth graders. It's creating systems that work for people instead of against them. That's my engineering." Mason understood completely. They were both people who saw structures and systems, who needed to build and fix and improve. The mediums were different, but the drive was the same. "When do you start?" he asked. "Technically, I already have. Filed the LLC paperwork last week. First project is a housing development in the next county over. Affordable units, community spaces, actual human-centered design." Her excitement was palpable. "I want to hire you." "What?" "As a consultant, or full-time if you want. I need someone who understands both the technical side and the human side, someone who cares about getting it right." Mason's first instinct was to say no, to retreat to the safety of the garage, the known quantity of car repairs. But looking at Vivien's face, seeing the vision she was building, he felt the pull of real work, meaningful work, work that mattered beyond individual customers. "I can't do full-time," he said carefully. "I have Ruby and the garage. But consulting, project-based work, that might work. That's all I'm asking. Help me design buildings that don't fail people. Use your expertise for something more than break jobs."
brake jobs matter too. I know. I'm not saying abandon the garage. I'm saying expand what you do. Vivien hopped off the desk, moved closer. We could do this together. Build something real. The we in that sentence felt significant. Not just professional collaboration, but partnership. The kind that extended beyond work into life. I need to think about it, Mason said. Of course. Take your time. But even as he said it, Mason knew what his answer would be. The excitement was already building, his brain engaging with possibilities and problems. This was what he was meant to do, not exclusively, but as part of a bigger life that included the garage and Ruby and Vivien and work that challenged him. Balance. He was learning balance. That night at dinner, Ruby listened to Mason explain Vivien's offer with the focus she brought to everything important. You should do it, she said when he finished. It's a big commitment. So? You can handle big commitments. You're raising me, aren't you? That's different. It's really not. You're already doing the school. This is just more of that. Mason picked at his food. What if I mess it up, get too focused, and forget about you? Ruby set down her fork, fixing him with a look that was far too mature for 9 years old. Dad, you're not going to forget about me. You're paranoid about forgetting about me. That's literally the opposite problem. I'm not paranoid. You check on me 3 times every night. You ask about my day every morning. You know my entire schedule by heart. She softened her tone. I know you're scared of making the same mistakes you think you made with Mom, but you're different now. You pay attention differently. How do you know? Because I know you. You've changed. You learned. Ruby reached across the table, took his hand. And anyway, I'm not Mom. I'm here. I can tell you if I need more attention. We can figure it out together. Mason felt his throat tighten. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. You're just finally listening. They finished dinner, cleaned up together, fell into their evening routine. But Mason's mind was already working through logistics. How to structure consulting work around garage hours. What kind of projects would fit his capabilities. How to maintain boundaries while still engaging fully. He texted Vivien around 9. I'm in. Let's talk specifics tomorrow. The response came immediately. Really? You're sure? I'm terrified, but yes. That seems to be our baseline state. Works for me. Mason smiled at his phone, feeling the familiar mix of fear and excitement that seemed to characterize everything now. Growth was uncomfortable. Change was hard. But staying frozen was harder. The next few weeks blurred into activity. Vivien's development company moved forward, Mason consulting on the housing project alongside his garage work. It was challenging, requiring careful time management and constant communication. But it worked. Ruby helped keep him organized. Vivien was flexible about scheduling, and Mason discovered he could actually handle multiple priorities without everything collapsing. The housing project was exactly the kind of work he'd been missing. Real problems, human stakes, design that mattered. He spent hours developing structural solutions that maximized space and minimized cost, creating affordable housing that didn't look or feel cheap. Vivien handled the business side, the community engagement, the 100 details that made development actually work. They were good together. Professionally and personally, they balanced each other. 2 months after the school project finished, Vivien invited Mason and Ruby to dinner at her place. Not a restaurant, not neutral ground, her actual apartment in the city. Mason spent the drive trying not to overthink it, failing completely. It's just dinner, Ruby said from the passenger seat. I know. At her place, where she lives. That's kind of significant. I know that too. So stop being weird about it. Vivien's apartment was in a historic building downtown, the kind of place that had probably been warehouses once and now housed people with too much money. But inside, her space was surprisingly warm. Books everywhere, art that looked personal rather than expensive, furniture that seemed chosen for comfort over status. This is nice, Mason said, looking around. It's too big for one person. I keep thinking I should downsize. Vivien was in the kitchen doing something with vegetables that looked complicated. Make yourselves at home. Ruby, there's art supplies in the spare room if you want to draw or whatever. Ruby, bless her, took the hint and disappeared. Mason joined Vivien in the kitchen, watching her cook with the same focus she brought to everything. Can I help? He asked. You can keep me company. I'm not good enough at this to multitask. They talked while she cooked, easy conversation about the housing project and Ruby's summer reading and nothing particularly deep. But the domesticity of it struck Mason, standing in a kitchen with someone, talking about daily life, sharing space. He hadn't done this since Sarah. The thought didn't hurt as much as it used to. Sarah felt less like an open wound now, more like a scar. Present, but healed. Dinner was good. Vivien had overcomplicated the recipe, but it worked anyway. Ruby asked questions about the development company, suggested organizational improvements, made them both laugh with her observations about adult inefficiency. It felt like family. Not the family Mason had lost, but a new configuration that fit differently. After Ruby went to explore the building's rooftop garden, properly chaperoned by building security, Mason and Vivien sat on her couch with coffee. "This is nice," Vivien said. "Having people here? I usually just rattle around alone. You could get a roommate." "I could, or I could have people I care about visit more often." Mason understood the implication. "We could do that. Visit more." "I'd like that." Vivien set down her coffee, turned to face him fully. "Mason, I need to tell you something." His stomach dropped. "Okay. My father wants to meet you." That wasn't what Mason had expected. "Why?" "Because he's heard I'm seeing someone. Because he's heard I started a company. Because he's Warren Langford and he needs to control everything." Vivien looked nervous. "I told him no. Told him my personal life isn't his business. But he's persistent." "Do you want me to meet him?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to keep you completely separate from that part of my life. But part of me thinks if this," she gestured between them, "is going to be real, you'll have to deal with him eventually." "What do you want it to be? This thing between us?" Vivien took a breath. "I want it to be real. I want you and Ruby in my life in a way that's permanent and significant. I want to build things together, professionally and personally. I want—" She stopped, looking vulnerable. "I want a family. Not the one I grew up with, but something better, something chosen." Mason felt the weight of that admission, the enormity of what she was offering. A family. Not replacing what he'd lost, but creating something new. With Vivien, with Ruby, with work that mattered, and connection that felt real. "I want that too," he said quietly. "It scares me, but I want it. So we try?" "We try." Vivien kissed him, longer and deeper than the first time. Mason let himself fall into it, let himself feel it without the constant background anxiety that usually accompanied caring about things. When they finally pulled apart, Ruby was standing in the doorway looking smug. "The garden's really nice," she announced. "You guys should see it." They went to the roof, the three of them, and looked out over the city. Light spread in every direction, buildings Mason might have designed in another life, streets Vivien might develop in this one. The future felt vast and uncertain and full of possibility. "I could get used to this," Ruby said, leaning against the railing. "The view?" Vivien asked. "All of it. Having more people, doing interesting things, Dad being happy." Mason pulled his daughter close, then extended his other arm to Vivien. She fit against his side like she'd been designed for the space. They stood like that, three people who'd all been running from different things, who'd found each other in the wreckage of their separate fears. 3 months later, Mason stood in Millbrook Elementary's cafeteria with 200 people celebrating the completion of Phase 2 foundation repairs. The work had been funded by Vivien's foundation, her first major project, and supervised by Mason between garage jobs and housing development consulting. Dr. Chen gave a speech thanking everyone involved. Ruby presented a drawing she'd made of the building's structural system, explaining drainage and load paths to an audience that was probably only understanding half of it. Vivien talked about community investment and the importance of infrastructure. When they asked Mason to say something, he almost refused. But looking at the faces in the crowd, teachers and students and parents who'd benefit from safe buildings, he found words. 3 years ago, I thought I was done with engineering, he said. I'd convinced myself that caring about work meant failing at life, that I couldn't be both a good engineer and a good father, couldn't balance professional excellence with personal attention. I was wrong. He found Ruby in the crowd, saw her encouraging smile. The truth is, we're not built for just one thing.
We're complex, capable of caring about multiple things simultaneously. The trick is learning to pay attention to all of it, to build systems that support balance instead of demanding sacrifice. Mason gestured at the building around them. This school is stronger now because we addressed the foundation. But foundations aren't just concrete and rebar, they're the people and values and connections that hold us up. He looked at Vivien, standing near the front, eyes bright. I'm grateful to everyone who helped rebuild this building, but I'm more grateful to the people who helped rebuild my foundation, who reminded me that being human means trying and failing and trying again, who showed me that the best structures are the ones we build together. The applause was generous. Mason stepped down, immediately surrounded by Ruby and Vivien. They didn't say anything, just stood close, a unit of three that felt solid and real. Later, after the event, they drove back to the garage. Ruby fell asleep in the back seat. Vivien rode in front, her hand in Mason's. That was a good speech, she said. I was terrified. It didn't show. Mason pulled into his usual parking spot, looked at the garage that had been his refuge and prison for 3 years. It looked different now, not smaller, just one part of a bigger life instead of the entire thing. I've been thinking, Vivien said, about the future, about us. Yeah? Ruby's going to need a bigger room soon, and you could use a proper office for the consulting work. And I'm tired of living alone in that giant apartment. Mason's heart started beating faster. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe we look for a place, together, the three of us. She rushed to add, not immediately, we can take our time, but eventually, if you want. Mason looked at his daughter sleeping in the back seat, this kid who'd survived him at his worst and somehow still believed he could be better. Then at Vivien, this woman who'd walked into his life during a rainstorm and refused to let him hide. I want, he said simply. Vivien's smile was bright enough to light the parking lot. Okay then, eventually. Eventually. They sat in the quiet truck, not rushing to move, just being together. Mason thought about Sarah, about the family he'd lost and the guilt he'd carried. But sitting here with Vivien and Ruby, he realized healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant making space for new things alongside the grief. It meant building structures strong enough to hold both loss and hope. Ruby stirred, opened her eyes. Are we home? Yeah, kiddo, we're home. Good. I'm exhausted from being charming all night. She stretched, then seemed to register the atmosphere. Did something happen? Vivien's going to look for a place with us, Mason said. Sometime, maybe. Ruby sat up, suddenly wide awake. Really? Like move in together? Eventually, Vivien confirmed. Dad, that's really good. Ruby looked between them. I'm proud of you, both of you, for being brave. Mason felt his throat tighten. His daughter, proud of him for doing what should have been natural all along, choosing connection over isolation, building instead of hiding. They went upstairs, the three of them. Made tea, talked about nothing important, fell into the comfortable rhythm of people who belong together. When Vivien finally left around midnight, she kissed Mason goodbye in a way that promised more evenings like this, more building towards something permanent. After she left, Mason checked on Ruby. She was in bed, reading by lamplight. You okay? He asked from the doorway. More than okay. Are you? Mason considered the question honestly. 3 years ago, he'd been broken, convinced he'd failed everyone who mattered. Now he had consulting work he cared about, a garage that kept him grounded, a daughter who was thriving, and a partner who understood him in ways he'd never expected. Yeah, he said. I think I am. Good. You deserve to be happy, Dad, even if you don't always believe it. When did you become the wise one? I've always been the wise one. You just started listening. Mason smiled, turned off her light, closed her door. He stood in the quiet apartment, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling, the distant hum of traffic. But it didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like foundation, solid and stable, and ready to support whatever came next. He thought about Warren Langford, about meeting the man eventually, dealing with expectations and judgment, but that was a problem for later. Tonight he was just a man who'd been given a second chance at life and was finally learning to take it. Mason sat at his desk, pulled out a notebook, and started sketching. Not for any specific project, just ideas. Building designs that incorporated community space, housing that prioritized human connection, structures that held people instead of isolating them. The work flowed easily. his hand remembering motions it hadn't made in years. He was an engineer, a father, a partner, a person trying to build a life that balanced all the things he cared about. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated and required constant attention. But it was real. And real, Mason had learned, was better than safe. Outside, rain started to fall. Not the vengeful storm from months ago, but a gentle summer rain that nourished instead of destroyed. Mason listened to it drum against the windows and thought about Vivien's car breaking down, about Ruby's wisdom, about foundations that needed repair, and the courage it took to admit things were broken. Everything worth building required strong foundations, but the strongest foundations weren't the ones that never cracked. They were the ones that got repaired properly, reinforced carefully, maintained with attention and care. Mason was learning to be that kind of foundation, for Ruby, for Vivien, for himself. It was hard work, the hardest he'd ever done. But watching rain fall on a town that felt like home again, thinking about a future that included love and work and family, Mason decided the hard work was worth it. Everything worth doing was hard. His mother-in-law had been right about that. The important thing was doing it anyway.